The birth of monumental statuary in stone. During the reign of Djoser, a departure in sculpture took place that was equal in importance to contemporary advances in architecture. An increase in scale, a relaxation in demeanor, the objective rendering of anatomical detail, and a heightened realism are innovations that separate the stiff statue of Khafre, the last ruler of the Archaic period, Egyptian Museum, Cairo, J32161, from the arresting portrait of Djoser, figure 29. 39. These changes reflect skillful stoneworking that developed as a result of technical progress. They also indicate new ideas. In the private realm, the break is less noticeable, since few non-royal statues of the Archaic period are preserved. However, the exceptional group of 3 statues of Sepa and Nessa from the early 3rd dynasty illustrates the remarkable advance. Cat. Nose. RR 13. The provenance of these works is assumed to be Saqqara, and their dates can be further refined if Sepa can be identified with A mentioned on a vase fragment discovered in the step pyramid of Djoser. 40. None of the nearly life-size limestone figures has a back pillar. Traces of paint are abundant, black on the wigs and eyes, green on bracelets and the cosmetic bands beneath the eyes. Despite their close to lifelike proportions, the body is 7 times the height of the head. They have broad, flat faces and an air of solidity that is accentuated by such features as a short neck, stiff arms held close to the body or bent at a sharp right angle, thick legs and ankles, and incompletely disengaged legs. Special attention was given to the faces, whose finely detailed features reflect peace and contentment. Noteworthy is Nessa's unusual wig. In front, the parallel tresses end in narrow tiers, giving the impression of triple thickness. 2 smaller female statues are executed in the same vein, the Lady of Bros. S4 and the Princess Regi seated, cat. Number 16. The latter bears a relation to the statue of Djoser, figure 29, in the careful treatment of the face with its perfect polish. Carved, like the Princess Regi seated, of hard stone and featuring a similar seat that imitates bentwood furniture are 4 statues dating to the 3rd dynasty, 2 of Ankh, cat. Numbers 14, 15, who probably served Djoser, 1 of Ankh-Wa, 42 who clutches and adds as a sign of his profession, he was a carpenter, figure 30, and 1 of Mechen, cat. Number 28, found in the chapel, with inscriptions dating to the reign of Snefru. Although these individuals are all seated, there is great diversity in the position of the arms with hands joined, holding an emblem on the shoulder, and placed on the chest or on the knee. 2 types of wigs are worn, one with horizontal waves, the other with tight curls like the headdress seen in the reliefs of Hesi-Re, cat. Number 17. The priest Hetep 43 who is probably a contemporary of Mechen since the statues of the 2 men have stylistic affinities, is shown kneeling, a pose rarely repeated. 44 This sculpture's features are entirely characteristic of non-royal statuary of the early Old Kingdom, a disproportionately large head, a short neck, and stiff angular limbs held against the compact body, which the artist worked on all 4 sides. The quest for Ind Ividualitai. Found in the tomb at Meidum, the seated statues of Ra-Hotep, presumably a son of King Snefru and his wife, Nofret, mark a crucial step in the direction of realistic representation, figure 31. Every feature of the works contributes to this impression. Both figures are nearly life-size. The various planes of Ra-Hotep's nude torso, although summarily modeled, emerge harmoniously articulated from the block of limestone. The back of the block was used to make a high back slab. The carefully sculpted facial features and details of dress give each figure individuality. A rich polychromy contrasts with the immaculate white of the clothing and thrones, and the impact of the eyes inlaid with rock crystal and quartz is extraordinary. The artist achieved his goal of creating living images, and we can appreciate the fright that gripped the workmen when they discovered the figures in 1871. The naturalism of these works is achieved with austere modeling and with a simplified rendering of surfaces. The same effect and technical skill are evident in the statue of the Vizier Heminu, cat. Number 44, a close associate of King Khufu. The flaccid pectoral muscles and the fleshy, distended abdomen are unflattering observations that suggest the corpulence of a mature man, whose aquiline nose and imperious mouth express an inflexible character. An equally powerful individuality and severity are achieved through the elimination of minor details in the reserve heads deposited in the burial chambers of the Western Cemetery at Giza, cat. Numbers 46 to 49. 45 This austere style contrasts with a contemporary trend that stressed sensitivity to modeling, softness, and a taste for detail here as in royal statuary. The bust of Angkaf, figure 32, illustrates the tendency perfectly. To his keen observation of bone structure, the artist was able to bring to bear delicate modeling that conjures with precision and subtlety the weary visage of King Khafre's vizier, his tired gaze, and the quiver of sagging flesh. Few other non-royal statues from the 4th dynasty are as securely dated, differing sharply from the royal model or statues of scribes. The series commences with the figure of Khalab, a son of Khufu, in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, 13.3140, and includes other princes, Setka, cat. Number 55, son of King Jafer, with paunchy belly and a face riddled with fat, and Quain Ri, cat. Number 72, son of King Menkore, whose torso is recreated in ample volumes and whose otherwise conventional face is enlivened by the asymmetry of the mouth. In these examples the arms remain attached to the torso, although the technique of separating them from the body below the shoulder had already been mastered by the reign of Khufu. Dated to the 4th dynasty are several statues of couples who demonstrate a special tenderness toward each other, with a restraint typical of Egyptian art. The Lady Merci Ankh 47 lovingly embraces her husband, Rahar Ka, and ventures to place a hand on his forearm, recalling the identical pose of the wife of Menkore in the monumental pear statue in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, cat. Number 67. Mamie wraps his arm around his wife's neck, cat. Number 84. Expressing his affection in exactly the same way Hetep hears too reveals her feelings toward her daughter Merci Ankh 3 in a statue also in Boston, 30. R45-6. This manner of showing familiarity vanishes at the start of the 5th dynasty and thus can be used as a criterion for dating. 48. Among the rare family groups that are dated is that of the Lady Kente Ka and her son, cat. Number 80. 49 seated on a throne with a high back slab, Kente Ka is in many ways similar to the figure of Nofret from Meidum, figure 31. Her radiant face is framed by a large wig that permits her own parted hair to show. With an ample body and stout ankles, she exudes the same air of robust health observable in the royal statuary of the period. 50 The nude little boy, shown standing at his mother's feet, wears the braided sidelock of youth and holds a finger to his mouth. He is as tall as his mother's seat, following a convention of scale peculiar to Old Kingdom statuary. 51 Long of uncertain date, the statue group of Senum the dwarf and his family, Egyptian Museum, Cairo, J5 or 280, is today firmly assigned to the reign of Jafer. 52 Senub's wife, who embraces him affectionately, closely resembles Kente Ka and displays the same coiffure. The 2 standing children, who balance the composition, are also no taller than the top of the bench shown behind them. The cross-legged pose of the dwarf somewhat obscures the difference in height of the principal figures without concealing his overlarge head and atrophied legs. The artist lightened the work by dispensing with a back slab and incorporating voids, or negative space, into the ensemble, achieving a masterpiece of equilibrium. Other famous works of art can be dated to this period of experiment, during which artists tended in the direct tie-in of the realistic and the particular, scrupulously observing the marks of age or infirmity. The original forms they created were forgotten, however, in the 5th dynasty. One superb example is described in the Louvre, figure 33, 53 in which the artist paid close attention to the gaunt face and the inlaid eyes. The restrained modeling of the torso and abdomen calls to mind the treatment of the statue of Heminu. The same technique characterizes another fine example, the Sheikh elbowed, figure 34. 54 This undisputed masterpiece of large-scale statuary would may be a transitional example between the archaic period, when the art of monumental wood carving is well attested, and the 5th dynasty, from which time we have better known works. Dating from the close of the 4th dynasty, the tomb of Queen Merci Ankh III yielded one of the oldest series of statuettes of servants going about their tasks. The popularity of these attractive so-called models grew throughout the Old Kingdom. See Introduction to Cat. Numbers 136 to 143. Conformity and generalization. Beginning in the reign of Shepseskh, at the end of the 4th dynasty, the locale of non-royal cemeteries and royal tombs shifted from Giza to Saqqara, and most of the statuary of the 5th dynasty comes from the latter site. The king's son and vizier Bab F55 chose to build his tomb at Giza, and it affords fine examples from the transitional phase when statuary of high quality was made for a small number of privileged individuals. The archaeologists who discovered the tomb recovered fragments of between 30 and 50 statues. 56 types, sizes, and media are extremely varied. A small, perfectly preserved statue in granite of Bob Bef as a scribe 57 is notable for the slight inclination of the prince's head, suggestive of his concentration on the papyrus he is reading. A series of life-size limestone standing statues shows Bob Bef with an athletic body and large shoulders. The modeling is excellent but simplified. The heads have, unfortunately, disappeared. There's little variation in his clothing, which consists of either a short kilt with pleated flap or a mid-length kilt with hanging belt. In a series of alabaster statues, however, 3 styles of coiffure are displayed, curls clinging tightly to the subject's skull, cat. Number 87, a short, round wig, and a flaring wig that leaves the ear lobes exposed. The face, which in one example once had inlaid eyes, is doll-like, and the fullness of the cheeks is accentuated by furrows at the edges of the mouth. 58 In the same tomb were fragments of 2 pseudogroups in granite. In each group, 2 images of Bob Bef appear side by side, one seated and one standing. These constitute the earliest evidence of this special type of statue, of which there exists only a single royal example, that of Musor 59, although perhaps 30 such works showing non-royal persons are known. See cat. Number 187. 60. During the course of the 5th dynasty, as the administration of Egypt became more complex, an increasing number of private persons had access to a wide range of careers. Non-royal tombs multiplied, and the statuary that filled them is abundant, although of less homogeneous quality and often smaller in size than the earlier examples. For these sculptures would seem to have been the material of choice, but this impression may be the result of the vagaries of preservation. 61 Even in the most finished examples the workmanship seems perfunctory, and the types are so generalized that they can be compared to hieroglyphs. 62 Countenances, suffused with a timeless youth, are less distinctive, and the repertoire of accessory elements diminishes. It is difficult to say whether this development is a consequence of mass production 63 or of a shift in funerary beliefs. That there are exceptions to the rule must be noted, and we can point to original poses and details. The kneeling figure of the funerary priest Ka-Mkhed 64, figure 35, is remarkable for its pose and the superb treatment and brilliance of its eyes inlaid with black stone, a novel technique. The otherwise unremarkable statue of Ma-Nefer 65 is noteworthy for the scepter lying across the subject's breast. Here the artist revived a theme dating back to the 3rd dynasty. Unusual, too, is the procession of offering bearers that decorates the cubic seat of Sekhem-Ka. 66 On one of the 3 statues of Ahed-Hotep recently discovered at Saqqara, the emblem of the goddess Bat, suspended against a beaded sash, is picked out in sharp relief. This subdued and less expressive style of the 5th dynasty, often achieved with a sure technique, is found in 2 diorite statues from the tomb of Nenkefit-Ka, a courtier of King Sur, figures 36, 37. 68 A fragmentary sculpture shows the courtier beside his wife, who stands with her hand on his arm. 69 A second Nenkefit-Ka, who probably lived at the same time and was buried in the provincial cemetery of Dis-Hasha, in the south of Fayum, commissioned statues in all respects analogous to those from the Memphite region. 70 Made some 20 years later, the monumental statue of T, figure 38, a contemporary of Musor, is striking for the simplification of the musculature and the schematic modeling of the face. This statue is very different from the subtle bas-reliefs that adorn this official's famous funerary chapel at Saqqara. 71 We can detect a refined sensibility and a taste for detail in the series sculpted for overseer of the granary Nikari. See Introduction to Cat. Numbers 127 to 130, a less important contemporary of T. Several family groups accompany individual statues of the deceased, who is rendered in a variety of poses and materials. Some tombs at Saqqara that probably date to the end of the 5th dynasty have yielded clusters of stuccoed and painted wood statues of exceptional size and condition. Of 11 acacia wood statues showing Mitre and his family located in New York, Cairo, and Stockholm, many are life-size. Despite the plasticity of the medium, the group is very rigid, the postures are stiff, and the modeling of the faces is rough. Special mention must be made of a female figure in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, who wears a rare tripartite wig. 72 And the large figure of a scribe with inlaid eyes in the same museum. 73 It should also be noted that in the Serdab of Mitre was found a wood statuette of a hunchback. Egyptian Museum, Cairo, J50 2081. Hunchbacks are among the subjects depicted in a sequence of models from the end of the 4th dynasty. The material prefigures the statuettes of servants of the First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom. Of quite a different quality is the splendid statue of Sennacherib ibn Mahdi, chief architect of King Yunis, which was found at Giza, figure 39. The entirely nude large-scale figure stands with one arm extended. The treatment of the slim body is extremely delicate, and the modeling of the face, with eyes that were once inlaid, is done with close attention to realistic details. The oblique lines between mouth and nose, and the mouth with its thick lips and truncated corners announce the advent of what Egyptologists call the second style of the 6th dynasty, 74, as do the subject's nakedness and his elongated silhouette. Some of these features, as well as the long kilt with quilted front panel worn by T, are also found in two representations of Mechichi, 75, whose tomb is customarily dated to the reign of Yunis, Cat. Numbers 151 to 157, while other statues of him are executed in the style of the Earlier 5th dynasty. The second style. The second style was probably created at Saqqara during the reign of Yunis. It developed during the course of the 6th dynasty and was broadly disseminated at the moment that the emergence of provincial power centers offered artists new sources of patronage for their work. During this period, statues in wood were made in great numbers. These are usually small in scale and show such an idiosyncratic view of the human form that it is possible to speak of mannerism 77 or exaggeration 78 in describing them. The head is disproportionately large, the body is elongated, with a pinched waist, and the musculature is only minimally delineated. The face is characterized by immense and often staring eyes, a short, stubby nose, and a strong mouth. The corners of the lips can be marked with a vertical stroke or left open. The vitality of the countenance is heightened by the emphatic use of grooves emanating from the nose and from the corners of the upper lip. Also characteristic of the statuary of this dynasty is the pairing of the slender and often nude figure of an adolescent with depictions of the same person when mature, 79, probably in an attempt to immortalize the individual at various stages of life. Examples of this practice have been found in the necropolises at Akhmim, figures 42, 43, and Mer. The stone and wood standing figures of Chiji from Saqqara, Metropolitan Museum, 26.2.8, 26.2.9, illustrate the distinctive features of the style: 80, a flaring wig revealing the ears, hair either cut short against the skull or bristling, and a long kilt. The navel, which had long been shown as a semicircle, becomes a circular hollow, and the limbs are cut free of the body, creating negative space. 81, unfortunately these works cannot be assigned to a particular reign. The limestone statue of Nekibu, figure 41, interred at Giza during the kingship of Pepi I, has very pronounced features, huge almond-shaped eyes that convey a haggard look, a large nose, and a thick mouth. 82, the work can be compared with the seated statue of Kar, figure 40, governor of the province of Edfu in the time of Mariner. 83, less distorted, however, than the statue of Nekibu. The latter is done with care and simplicity. The various surfaces of the figure are sharply differentiated. The pinched waist and the elongated fingers and toes are also noteworthy. The flaring wig curves to frame a face with second-style features. A pose unusual for its asymmetry came into fashion during the 6th dynasty. The subject is shown seated on the ground with one knee drawn up and the other flat on the ground, cat. Number 186. 84, numerous isolated instances of the type are known, and it occurs in a series of statues recently found at Saqqara that are inscribed with the name IP.85. In this era of innovation, themes abandoned after the 4th dynasty were rediscovered. Pepi, governor of Balat in the time of Pepi I, chose to be shown seated with his wife, and the couple share an unusual chair with lion-footed legs, figures 44, 45. 86, the slimness of his body, the thickness of his lips, slightly notched where they join, and the furrows accentuating the nostrils are all typical of the 6th dynasty style. But the provincial artist, who used the local limestone, returned in this work to a theme introduced at Giza in the rock-hewed statues of Queen Mer C.3 that of figures closely intertwined. Similarly, Izzy of Edfu and Pepi the middle of Mer, two local governors who served under Pepi I and Pepi II, respectively, are each shown seated on a chair with a very high back slab in the company of their wives, who make affectionate gestures. Do such stylistic changes reflect the determination of new patrons, more and more of whom were commoners living in the provinces, to impose their own values? The stylistic trend began at the start of the 6th dynasty, at a time when the power of the pharaoh was not threatened by provincial elites, and the contrary is likely, It is probable that royal statuary created in the Memphite region and the focus of cults in the Ka houses helped to spread the new style throughout Egypt. 89 The reasons for this change, perhaps religious in origin, were in any case sufficiently profound that this late Old Kingdom style persisted in the workshops of the first intermediate period and at length inspired the early masterpieces of the Middle Kingdom. Reserve heads. An enigma of Old Kingdom sculpture. While excavating at Deshire in 1894, Jacques de Morgan discovered the first reserve head ever encountered. It came from a tomb dated to the 4th dynasty, sometime between the late years of Senfru's reign and the middle of the reign of his son Khufu. 1 This head has close affinities with two others found later in the Western Cemetery at Giza and is probably among the earliest of the entire series. It is also one of only 4 found outside the Giza necropolis, 2 which has yielded 27 examples, 3 most from the reigns of Khufu and Khafra, who was Khufu's son and second successor in the 4th dynasty. 4. Reserve heads are unique in Egyptian art because each one was made to be complete in itself, not as part of a statue. Every head is cut off flat at the base of the neck, allowing it to stand upright. All are represented with short cropped hair or perhaps shaven heads. A large proportion also show evidence of intentional damage to the ears and the back of the head. Many reserve heads were carved from fine white limestone with the features well formed and the surface carefully smoothed. Some, however, were quite crudely carved and appear to have been finished with substantial amounts of plaster. 5 and 2 were made from finely ground Nile mud. Reserve heads as portraits. Although there are many affinities among the heads, each has particular characteristics that distinguish it from the others, as can be seen in a photograph of a group from Giza, figure 46. 7 This individuality has led many scholars to describe reserve heads as portraits. George Reisner, who discovered more than half of the excavated exemplars, went a step further, perceiving family relationships among the heads he uncovered. 8 For example, on the basis of similarities between heads from Mastabas G4240, Cairo J46215, figure 46D, and G4440, Boston 14. 718, figure 46 grams, he identified the tomb owners as broth-ers. At approximately 30 centimeters in height, these heads are 2 of the largest. 9 The chief feature they share is the long, narrow shape of the face, apparent when they are seen from the front. However, when viewed from any other angle, the resemblance dissipates. 10 Reisner also believed he could determine the ethnic background of individuals represented by the heads. For example, he identified Cairo J46218, G4340, figure 46C, and Cairo J46216, G4640, figure 46A, as West Asiatic. 11 Although both have characteristics in common with others he thought represented native Egyptians. While individual reserve heads may have been made to resemble the people in whose tombs they were placed, it is equally possible that the similarities among these works are the result of conventions used by an individual artist or group of artists. Any study of the reserve heads must involve grouping them according to type, a highly subjective exercise in which each viewer will find different affinities. The chief obstacle to any definitive comparison or analysis of the heads is a lack of good, comprehensive photographs. No photographs exist of certain examples, and only one view has been published of others. In many cases photographs have been taken from different angles, some from above, some from below, some with the head turned slightly to the right or left but almost never rotated to the same degree. And views of the backs of the heads are largely unavailable. There are, however, excellent scaled photographs of most of the examples excavated by Reisner, and Roland Tefnin has provided multiple views of many pieces. RZ. Using these resources, it is possible to discern numerous stylistic parallels among the sculptures. For example, it is apparent that Cairo J46218, G4340, figure 46C, one of Reisner's West Asiatics, has a number of features in common with Boston 14.717, G440, figure 46F, and Boston 21.328, G4540, figure 466, Cat. Number 47, 2 heads Reisner considered to represent native Egyptians. 13. Most of the reserve heads found at Giza probably were created by 1 or 2 generations of sculptors whose careers span the reigns of Khufu, Jadfer, and Khafra, and it is not surprising that these examples can be divided into other stylistic groupings. 14 More unexpected are the affinities that seem to connect the head unearthed by Morgan at Dashur, Cairo CG 519, with two excavated at Giza, Berkeley 6 to 19,767, G 1203, Cat. Number 46, and Cairo J 46,217, G 4140, figure 46E. 15 The proportions of the three faces, with their full cheeks and soft chins, are very similar, and the mouths, eyes, and sculpted eyebrows have much in common as well. These parallels appear to bind the two Giza heads very closely in date, and perhaps even in site of manufacture, with the head from Dashur, a royal necropolis approximately 14 miles to the south that was diminishing in importance while Giza was becoming the preeminent royal burial ground. 6 Further attempts to link heads stylistically using first-hand examination and up-to-date, comprehensive photographs might produce very interesting results. Archaeological context. The archaeological context of the 31 excavated reserve heads is somewhat ambiguous. The majority were found in the substructures of their respective tombs, in either the shaft or the burial chamber. R7 and not one was associated with an above-ground offering chapel. This distinguishes them from other types of Old Kingdom funerary statues, which played a role in the offering cult and usually were either located in full view somewhere in the offering chapel 18 or hidden in a statue chamber, or serdab. With one exception, the mastabas in which reserve heads were discovered had been ransacked by thieves in ancient times. Some may also have been entered later by ancient Egyptians searching for reusable building materials. The only head discovered in a context resembling its original location was excavated by Salim Hassan at Giza in a tomb that had been penetrated by water and mud but not plundered by thieves. This head was found in the burial chamber in front of the sarcophagus, lying on its side near floor level in the mud that had filled the room. 19 Although it was no longer in its original position, it seems most likely that the head was intended to stand upright on the floor. This find suggests that reserve heads were originally placed in the burial chamber of the tomb 20 rather than in the blocking of the entrance corridor 21 or in the shaft, where most were found, presumably having been thrown there when a tomb was robbed. Distribution in Giza Cemetery 4000. The majority of reserve heads were distributed among the three earliest cemeteries constructed to the west of Khufu's pyramid at Giza, collectively called the Western Cemetery. Cemeteries 1,200 and 2,100 yielded only one head each, but 18 were found in Cemetery 4000, nearly all of them in the group of 21 mastabas that belonged to the first three building phases identified by Reisner. 23 These structures form three rows of 7 tombs to the east of the huge mastaba of Heminu, G 4000, figure 47. The mastabas in this section of Cemetery 4000 and in Cemetery 1200 yielded a number of slab stelae, CCAT. Numbers 5153. Although most of the stelae were found in Cemetery 1200, where only one reserve head was discovered, it seems that these two types of funerary equipment appeared together more often than the numbers imply. While only 4 complete or fragmentary slab suiteli seem to have been found in the tomb chapels in Cemetery 4000, 9 other mastabas in the earliest tombs of this cemetery contain emplacements for stelae. Only 9 reserve heads were unearthed in these 13 tombs. See figure 47, but it is quite possible that they all once housed such heads. 2 of the mastabas that Reisner excavated contain 2 reserve heads each. One of these tombs, G 4140, belonged to the king's daughter Merit, whose name was recorded on a slab stela in her offering chapel. One head was found lying in the burial chamber, and the other had been uncovered near the bottom of the shaft. Reisner identified them as representing, respectively, Merit, figure 46E, and her husband, figure 46F. The 2 heads in the second mastaba, G 4440, were located together near the bottom of the shaft, and these Reisner identified as a prince, figure 46 grams, and his Nubian wife, figure 46 hours, cat. Number 48. Reisner believed that a third mastaba in the same area had also once housed 2 reserve heads. In 1913 he had found a head, figure 46D, and a neck fragment from a second one in mastaba G 4240, which contained a slab stela inscribed for the king's son Snefru Senub. During the later excavation season, while clearing mastaba G 5020 some distance to the southeast, he discovered a reserve head with a large chip broken out of its neck. The archaeological context of this head, which lay in shaft debris above the burial chamber door, convinced Reisner that it was intrusive, and he suggested that it portrayed the wife of Sinfru Seneb and had originally been deposited in G 4240.25. The presence in each of these mastabas of two reserve heads belonging to a husband and wife poses a problem that Reisner failed to address. The large core mastabas in the Great Western Cemetery were designed with only one shaft leading to a single, relatively small burial chamber, and the archaeological evidence suggests that they were used for only one burial. Neither mastaba G 4240 nor G 4440 has any contemporary subsidiary shafts for family members, and, since both men and women owned mastabas, a husband and wife might well have had separate, neighboring tombs. In the case of G 4140, the mastaba of Meritites, an annex was added to the north end of the superstructure and excavation of a shaft was begun, presumably for the burial of a close family member. However, there is no chamber at the bottom of this shaft, nor was the shaft itself used for a burial. 26 Since each reserve head seems to be an integral part of the burial equipment for a specific individual, one must ask why there would be two heads in tombs intended for only one person. The simplest answer is that one of the heads in each tomb is intrusive. Several of the earliest mastabas of Cemetery 4000 that were designed to have slab stele contained no reserve head when excavated. Three of these, G 4150, G 4250, and G 4450, are immediately north of the three mastabas in which Reisner found a pair of heads. This pattern of distribution leads to the obvious suggestion that one of the heads in G 4140, one in G 4440, and the neck fragment in G 4240, together with the head from G 5020, if it fits with that fragment, came from the neighboring mastabas to the north, having been displaced by robbers. Another reserve head, found in G 4940 but considered to be intrusive by Reisner, may also have come from one of the 21 earliest mastabas in Cemetery 4000.28. In addition, it should be noted that two heads of unfired clay were uncovered in Cemetery 4000, suggesting that some of the mastabas that contain no heads may have been equipped with examples of this more fragile variety, which either did not survive or were so badly damaged that they were not recognized by the excavators. Purpose. Since the heads clearly did not play a part in the offering cult, which was carried out above ground, scholars have long attempted to formulate another explanation for their existence. The earliest theory concerning their pure pose was put forward by Ludwig Burchard, who in 1903 discovered a head at Abusir that was only the second OND to have been found at 30. He suggested that they were intended to protect or replace the head of the deceased, an idea with which both Reisner and Hermann Juncker generally agreed. Juncker went on to suggest that the heads served a purpose similar to that of the plaster face mask, cat. Number 197, uncovered in a number of Old Kingdom tombs. William Stevenson Smith carried this thought a step further, hypothesizing that the heads and masks were precursors of the cartonnage mummy masks that began to appear in the First Intermediate Period. 32. Theories connecting the reserve heads to the evolution of mummy masks, and perhaps even to anthropoid coffins, are supported by the fact that the heads do not seem to correspond to any other type of funeral equipment documented for later periods. Although there is no evidence that they were used outside the Memphite area during the Old Kingdom, one possible distant parallel, documented at Thebes, appeared some 12 centuries later in the tomb of Tutankhamun. This is the wood sculpture of a life-size head emerging from a lotus blossom. The Tutankhamun piece was made in several sections, with the head as a separate element. Although entirely different in style and medium from the Old Kingdom reserve heads, the Tutankhamun head has various features in common with them. It was not made as part of a statue. The neck is cut off flat at the bottom, which would allow it to stand on its own, and the hair, represented by small dots that cover the top of the skull, is close-shaven. This sculpture, whose precise fine spot unfortunately is in question, 33 is generally understood to represent the infant sun god being born, a powerful symbol of the pharaoh's anticipated rebirth. Its connect time to Old Kingdom reserve heads, although extremely tenuous, suggests a magical function for the earlier works that is consistent with the generally accepted theories associating them with the development of the mummy mask and anthropoid coffin. It is quite possible that reserve heads served as symbols of the sun god or the god Autumn appearing at the moment of creation on the primeval mound, which itself may even have been imitated by a mound of earth or sand on the floor of the burial chamber. Intentional damage. Although existing theories concerning the function of reserve heads explain why they were placed in the substructure of the tomb, none successfully accounts for the widespread mutilation of the heads. Since all reserve heads were discovered in disturbed archaeological contexts, it is not surprising that even the best preserved examples have suffered abrasions and chips to the surface and even occasionally have lost part of the nose. However, two types of damage typically found among reserve heads are notable because they occur rarely in other types of Egyptian sculpture. For this reason, they are presumed to represent intentional mutilation rather than accidental damage. Only 26 of the 31 excavated reserve heads are well enough preserved to be used in a discussion of intentional mutilation and accidental damage. 34. The most universal form of mutilation is removal of the ears. Among 15 heads that probably had sculpted ears, only Boston 14.719, cat. Number 48, has its ears intact. Removal of the ears takes several forms. On some heads, such as Vienna 7787, cat. Number 49, they have been kai'd off close to the surface in a relatively careful and even manner. On others, for example Berkeley 6 to 19767, cat. Number 46, the prominent parts have been chipped away, leaving a distinct outline, or hacked off in a more haphazard fashion, as on Boston 21.328, cat. Number 47. Most members of a small group of heads whose ears were made as separate elements and attached with plaster tendons were found with one or both ears missing. 351 might assume that these ears broke off due to rough handling by tomb robbers if it were not for the 14 examples missing their sculpted ears. A third group, which includes the Deshire head, was created without any provision for ears. This omission may represent a stylistic preference of a particular artist or patron or may be connected in some way to the intentional removal of ears from at least 14 heads. Another type of mutilation suffered by a significant number of reserve heads is the single or double line that was scratched or more often gouged into the finished surface from the crown to the nape of the neck. Because written descriptions of the heads are not always complete and the backs often have not been photographed, this form of damage is not as well documented as the removal of the ears. However, it is known that of the 26 examples under consideration 15, including cat. Number 49, exhibit these lines in 5, including cat. Numbers 46 to 48, do not, leaving 6 in question. Junker and Reisner both mention that the ears were usually missing from the heads, but neither appears to have found this particularly significant. Both excavators also describe the grooves that appear in many examples. While Junker made no attempt to account for this phenomenon, Reisner suggested that the gouges may have been made by thieves trying to determine if the heads were hollow. 36 This explanation is rather unsatisfactory, however, since such information could have been obtained more easily by simply smashing the objects. 37. In more recent years, scholars have put forward a number of other theories regarding the mutilation of reserve heads. Nicholas Millet has proposed that they served as sculptors' models. See Introduction to Cat. Numbers 46 to 49. 38 In addition, he suggests that molds were taken of the heads for the preparation of plaster mummy masks and speculates that the gouges down the backs of some were made when the molds were cut open and removed, a process that also caused the damage to the ears. This interesting theory finds no support in the preserved record. No contemporary statuary has been found in tombs containing reserve heads. 39 And, in fact, the only type of sculpture that can be connected firmly with them is the slab stela, with its single representation of the deceased seated before an offering table. 40 Thus, there would seem to have been no need for sculptors' models, certainly not ones carved of fine limestone. Moreover, all of the extant plaster masks appear to have been modeled on the mummy itself, not cast. See entry for cat. Number 197. Another, far more elaborate explanation for the mutilation has been set out by Tefnin. 41 In his detailed study, Tefnin catalogues what he believes to be ritual mutilation carried out when the heads were placed in their tombs. He likens this practice to the mutilating of animal figurines and hieroglyphs of dangerous animals on objects deposited in tombs of the First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom. According to this theory, the heads had to be ritually killed in order to render them harmless to the deceased, because they were in the substructure of the tomb, in close proximity to the body. Tefnin's suggestions are well presented and intriguing but somewhat problematic. In order to make his case, the author classifies 4 types of ritual mutilation, 42 which one would expect to see with some consistency in contemporary heads found in the same area if such acts had been performed to protect the deceased. Yet among the heads found in core mastabas of Cemetery 4000 at Giza, all of which were probably carved and buried within a generation or two, Not a single example exhibits all of Tefnon's forms of ritual damage. At least 3 show no evidence of a groove cut into the back of the head, the most unequivocal type of intentional damage, and 1, cat. Number 48, shows no damage that cannot convince. Only be explained as accidental. A much simpler explanation of the damage found on reserve heads was recently presented by Peter Lacovara, who hypothesizes that the grooves and a number of other marks they display are sculptors' guidelines, comparable to the incised guidelines seen on the so-called trial pieces of the Ptolemaic period. 43 However, the guidelines on the Ptolemaic objects are always finely and precisely carved on an unfinished flat surface, not gouged or hacked into a finished one like most of the grooves on reserve heads. In fact, the gouging of lines and damage to ears are inflicted too inconsistently to constitute conclusive evidence of ritual mutilation performed to protect the dead. Yet these forms of mutilation occur far too frequently to allow them to be discounted as accidental, and the gouges are too haphazardly and or violently executed to be sculptors' guidelines. It seems only marginally more likely that these types of damage were intentionally inflicted when the tombs were robbed or later when they were mined for reusable materials. Why would a robber or other intruder who feared the magical powers of the objects take the time to carefully remove the ears and scratch the backs of the heads, when smashing them would have taken less effort? Indeed, plunderers do seem to have broken at least 2 heads, Vienna 9290, G 4260, in New York 48.156, B 7560B, and possibly a third discovered in fragmentary form by Junker in G 4460, about which almost nothing is known. 44 and 3 other examples, Hildesheim 2158, G 4160, Boston 36126, B 7560B, in Boston April 27, 1219, G 7650C, the face was separated from the skull by a few well-placed blows and shows much abrasion around the eyes, nose, and mouth. 45 The question of why many reserve heads suffered unusual forms of mutilation must remain open for the present, since complete documentation of all the excavated examples is not available. One can only hope that new information derived from complete examinations of all the heads will help us to better understand the pure pose of this unique group of objects. Royal reliefs. By the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, the royal temples of the Pyramid Age had already started to fall into decay. What remained was often dismantled under the Ramesside kings of the 19th and 20th dynasties, about 1295 to 1070 BCE, who sent demolition parties to obtain stone material for vast new building projects. 2 As a result, modern excavations have brought to light few standing Old Kingdom temple walls. Typically only the foundations and lower wall courses are extant, while thousands of larger and smaller fragments from the original relief decoration cover these remains in the surrounding area. 3 It is therefore not surprising that this publication and the exhibition it accompanies are in the main concerned with fragments from the once large-scale royal reliefs of the Old Kingdom. Examining fragments has special advantages. The viewer is induced to focus on details of iconography and artistic execution that may be overlooked in a scrutiny of full-scale, relatively undamaged compositions. However, true appreciation of details must be based on some knowledge of a fragment's original context. Since Egyptian artists repeated a rather circumscribed set of iconographic configurations from temple to temple and from wall to wall, Egyptologists have been able to reconstruct, at least on paper, the overall compositions of a fair number of Old Kingdom royal reliefs. Beginnings. Much Old Kingdom relief iconography was codified by the start of the 3rd dynasty. The system had been developed during later pre-dynastic times in the Archaic period on objects of minor, or decorative, arts, vessels, combs, cosmetic palettes, and the like, often having ceremonial or funerary significance. 5 And possibly in paintings on now vanished mud plaster brick walls. 6 Rare remains of late 2nd dynasty architectural relief decoration testify to a pre-3rd dynasty emergence of large-scale stone reliefs, if only in specific parts of monuments otherwise built of mud brick. From the 3rd dynasty onward, many sacred buildings were erected entirely of stone and over time provided increasingly larger wall spaces on which established iconographic configurations could be developed and refined. The result was one of the world's most coherent illustrative systems, a complex pictorial language for the visual propagation of ideas on kingship and its religious connotations. Basic figural schemes. The Old Kingdom relief language is based on a strikingly small number of fundamental figural schemes. 8 The possibilities of combination were, however, unlimited, allowing this vocabulary to meet an infinite variety of pictorial needs and to be adapted to various forms of architecture. The basic figural element of Egyptian pictorial art is the single human figure, male or female, either standing, the male almost always with legs apart as if walking, seated, or in action. 9 In royal reliefs, the most conspicuous single figure in action is a man running or striding with legs wide apart and knees bent. 2 Non-active standing figures of approximately equal rank often form a unit in which the figures face each other or embrace. 10 The classic group of 2 figures of unequal rank shows the powerful pharaoh in a striding position. His raised right arm swings a weapon, and an enemy cowers at his feet. Cat. Number 8. From early on, single and double figures appeared on relief slabs set into niches. Cat. Number 9, 11 And on pillars in temple courtyards. 12 Occasionally 2 single figures might flank important architectural elements such as the statue niches in the temple of Sefru at Dashur. 13 On the whole, however, single figures were not used in royal monuments to emphasize such architectural features as niches, false doors, or doorways. 14 Even the important central niche doorways in the valley and pyramid temples were not flanked by large single images of the king or a god but rather by groups of 2 or more large interacting figures. Cat. No. RR8. The most important role of the prominent single figure in Old Kingdom royal relief was to serve as the focal point and unifying element in large-scale relief compositions, and it was as part of such compositions that large figures of the king dominated walls and rooms. Repetition of identical or similar single figures creates a row of figures that may be depicted along the walls of a room or a set of rooms, emphasizing the movement from one architectural space to the next. This scheme was employed to great advantage in the statue cult temple of Sefru at Dashur. 15 The earliest royal building from which a relief decoration is preserved to a substantial extent. 16 Situated roughly halfway between agricultural land and the King's Bent Pyramid, the temple was entered through an area containing 5 parallel rooms of elongated shape, the central one of which led into the temple courtyard. Figure 48. 17 On both long walls of this corridor-like central room, rows of exquisitely adorned women were represented in the bottom register, all facing toward the temple interior. Figures 49, 50. 18 The women, cat. Number 22, represented royal estates dedicated to providing sustenance in perpetuity for the ritual performances in the temple. Although the figures in Sefru's temple stand in the fashion customary for females with feet side by side, their repeated appearance, one behind the other, creates the image of a long cortege of offering bearers moving into the building. In later representations, most female estate personifications in fertility figures are shown in striding poses like those of their male counterparts. 19. In Sefru's Dashur temple reliefs, the registers above the estate personifications consisted mainly of large figure compositions showing the king enacting rituals of the B.C.E, the renewal festival of kingship, or conversing with gods and goddesses. One especially poignant scene depicted Sefru embraced by a lying goddess. 20 The combining off large compositions of 2 or 3 stationary figures in upper registers with rows of uniform smaller figures below was a major design achievement that was realized in the very first stages of Egyptian royal relief art. In addition to the units of stationary single and double figures and the progressions of rows of figures, Egyptian relief art had another principal scheme, the group action tableau. 2 Considerably more intricate in composition than single and double figure configurations. Group action tableaus show a multiplicity of figures in a wide range of poses, handling a variety of objects and interacting with one another in numerous ways. Although much has been written about the absence of truly narrative art in ancient Egypt, that is, art depicting specific historical events, 22 There can be no doubt that group action tableaus are of a narrative character, because they all tell a story in one way or another. 23 Most non-royal reliefs decorating tombs of Old Kingdom high officials depict scenes in which objects and provisions are produced for the funeral cult in workshops and through agriculture, animal husbandry, and so on. 24 In royal reliefs, scenes that show the making of things are less important, while representations of ritual performances and of the king acting as guarantor of state and cosmic order predominate. 25 The composition of group action tableaus. 26 Relies largely on the requirements of the subject matter, but it is characteristic of Egyptian art that even multifaceted narrative scenes were structured to fit into a general compositional scheme. Important organizational means were the arrangement of figures on common baselines, the typical register of Egyptian art, the placing of figures in groups in which everyone performs the same action, and the juxtaposition and repetition of gestures and poses. Informative examples of royal group action tableaus are the ritual scenes from the king's HEB said, seen here, and an example from the 4th dynasty, Cat. Number 23, in an inversion on 2 blocks from the 5th dynasty Sun Temple of King User, figure 51, cat. Number 121. Both works show a high degree of structural organization, with the exception of the standard bearer in the 4th dynasty piece, cat. Number 23. All figures act on common baselines and thus inside a firm system of registers. In the earlier relief, the close-knit group of officials on the right clarifies the compositional structure. In the 5th dynasty version, the somewhat larger figure of the enthroned king, impressively isolated in his double pavilion, serves as a focus and resting point in the narrative. A similar figure of the pharaoh must have appeared to the right of the preserved scene, and it is toward this missing royal person that most activities in the extant section are directed. Comparison of the 2 uppermost registers on the user blocks gives further insights into group action tableaus. In the register at the very top, an evenly spaced row of standard bearers advances toward the king on the right. A highly charged encounter takes place in the register below. 2 groups of officials and priests confront each other across 3 prostrate figures identified in the inscription as great ones, that is, leaders, in the center, with the first priest on the right crying, back, at the great ones. The narrative burden is conveyed by the expressive gestures of the opposed figures, the detailed depiction of various religious objects, and the written words. Group action tableaus often appear consecutively, with each scene depicting a separate episode of a single narrative. While rows of stationary figures achieve progression in space, sequences of group action tableaus convey progression in time. Sequential group action tableaus are often divided by vertical lines, such as those in the lower left corner of the user blocks and in the lower register of the blocks depicting the seasons, cat, nose. U9, 120. Such lines seem analogous to those used in the transcriptions of ritual instructions, or other texts, on papyrus rolls. 28. This correspondence is especially noticeable in the user HEB set scenes, which lack the unifying elements of wall-high figures of the king or a god. The user reliefs depicted the HEB set in more or less the same set of scenes at least 5 times, not only inside the chapel but also outside to the left and right of the doorway from the main courtyard. 29. Such repetition of a set of ritual images, reminiscent of litany and canta, Tions, reveals the intensity with which ancient Egyptian relief decoration attempted to magically evoke a meaningful other reality beyond everyday life. The combination of figural schemes and organization of large wall spaces. The rather uniform assemblage of register upon register of ritual group action tableaus in the HEB set antechamber room of Musur is unusual, figure 5R. Generally, Egyptian royal reliefs are part of an overall compositional system whose primary structural element is a very large, often wall-high figure of the king, a deity, or both. 30. In the most common type of composition, a large figure of the pharaoh is combined with several registers of smaller, non-royal personages, arranged in simple rows or participating in group actions. The classic example of such a composition, which comes from the Pyramid Temple of King Pepi II at Saqqara, figure 52, 31, shows 3 rows of gods meeting the king in the upper registers, while in the bottom register state officials, likewise arranged in a neat row, bow before him. Between gods and officials, the remains of another register present a group action tableau of the butchering of offering animals. But it is possible to follow the evolution of the compositional principle of combining a large focal figure with rows of smaller ones from its rudimentary beginnings in the late pre-dynastic and archaic periods to the end of the Old Kingdom. While the principle of arranging figures in horizontal registers was firmly in place by late pre-dynastic times, 32, that of combining a single large figure with several registers of smaller figures developed much more slowly. On the front of the famous Narmer palette from the beginning of the First Dynasty, 33, the king's figure is considerably larger than those of his followers, but only the beheaded enemies are shown in 7 arrow rows, one above the other. On the reverse of the palette, a falcon figure, leading an emblematically depicted enemy by the nose, appears in front of the shoulders and head of the king. However, there is no clear indication that this falcon on the enemy group occupies a register of its own above the larger and fully human enemy who kneels before the king. 34, a much clearer juxtaposition between a large royal figure and non-royal images in registers is found on the king's scorpion mace head, figure 53, 35, although even here a distinction is made between non-royal figures of medium size, which interact with the king in a landscape of astonishingly free composition, and the rows of small figures that precede and follow the pharaoh on several register levels. The combination of a large focal figure with several registers of smaller figures was not fully established at the end of the archaic period, as is demonstrated by a group of royal reliefs from the reign of Khafre, the last king of the Second Dynasty. 36 On a granite door frame found at the important Upper Egyptian town of Hierakonpolis, a number of small figures in 4 registers, one above the other, are inserted rather clumsily between 2 of the large principal figures, seemingly as an afterthought. None of the fragments from another architectural granite relief from the so-called fort at Hierakonpolis provides evidence for more advanced compositions. But on a piece that may date to the early 3rd Dynasty, a relief from the Temple of Hathor at the Upper Egyptian site of Gebelein, the combination of registers of smaller individuals behind the large figure of the king is handled with a marked increase in assurance and structural clarity. This relief does, however, still show a follower's figure of intermediate size standing on the same baseline as the king, a type of arrangement seen on the earlier King Scorpion macehead. From at least the early 4th Dynasty onward, the combination of a large figure with several registers of smaller figures is handled by artists with ever greater proficiency. In the statue temple of Sumfru at Dashur, only a few of the more than 1,500 preserved scenes above the rows of estates, figure 50, and that temple consisted of large single figures or groups of 2 or 3 large figures. Large figures and rows of smaller ones were skillfully combined, however, in reliefs from the later years of Sumfru's reign and the reign of Khufu, which followed. For instance, in the Heb scene dating late in Sumfru's reign, Cat. Number 2-3, the large figure of the pharaoh, which originally followed the standard bearer on the left, was surely at least as tall as 2 of the registers that are partially preserved on the fragments. 39 The presence of the same kind of arrangement can be deduced from the fan bearer's position in a relief fragment, Cat. Number 39, from the Pyramid Temple of Khufu, the man's placement close to the top makes sense only if he was part of at least 2 registers of attending figures located behind or in front of a large figure of the pharaoh. During the early part of the 5th Dynasty, under kings, a large focal figure with rows of smaller figures reached its highest development, with artists achieving great variety and remarkable subtlety in the figure correlations. A magnificent example is the depiction of the desert hunt of King Sur, Cat. No. RR2. This masterpiece of royal relief art, figure 5442, had its original place in the corridor south of the Pyramid Temple's central courtyard, Cat. No. Row. The simple figure will line up in front of a large image of the king has been transformed in this relief into a densely packed mass of terribly wounded and frightened animals inside a netted stockade. The animals are shown in a multiplicity of postures and groupings, with figures facing in diverse directions and overlapping in a variety of ways. The irregular assemblage contrasts with the dignified uniformity of the officials who march sedately behind Sur and at the bottom of the scene. This is an example of the age-old Egyptian juxtaposition of order and chaos, but Sur's artists have given unusual drama to the basic scheme and have depicted each of the animals with unequaled care and compassion. The poor state of reliefs from the funeral monuments of the kings who followed Sur makes it difficult to generalize about scene composition during their reigns. Fragments from the pyramid precinct of King Usur present many instances of rather uniform rows of officials and offering bearers. 43 Usur's designers appear to have lacked the compositional inventiveness of Sur's relief artists, but this judgment may be unfair given the much smaller number of preserved blocks from this reign. It should also be noted that in Usur's Sun Temple, artists used the traditional register system in a very innovative manner to describe the various natural events of the Ayat, inundation, Enchemo, harvest, seasons. The skill with which the register system was adapted to narrative requirements in these reliefs is right scene spans 2 registers and a bush is used to mask the transition between it and the smaller one at the left. 44. The most impressive relief remains from Usur's pyramid precinct, however, are large figure compositions, for example, the 7 royal sphinxes with enemies bod eyes under their paws, that adorn the causeway 45 in the magnificent throne scene, figure 5-5. Such scenes appear to indicate that large figure compositions gained renewed importance in the late 5th Dynasty and the 6th Dynasty, a hypothesis that is not contradicted by the few published blocks from the pyramid temples of Kings Char Isasi and Unis 46 and is supported by the reliefs in Pepi II's Pyramid Temple, the last monument of its kind built in the Old Kingdom. Enough relief fragments were preserved from Pepi II's important precinct to have allowed the excavator, Gustav Jequier, to reconstruct a great number of scenes in their entirety. The reconstructions reveal that by the late 6th Dynasty, royal relief design had undergone a striking change. In the Pyramid Temple of Pepi II, compositions such as that showing the king with gods and officials, figure 52, are antechamber, 48 and in the mortuary cult sanctuary, the last one with a figure of the king seated instead of standing. 49 None of these reliefs are very inspired compositions, and in all the other rooms of the temple a variant scheme prevails. In this variant, large often almost wall-high figures of the king and various deities take up the greatest amount of space, while rows of small figures are not present 50 or are reduced to rudimentary groups that occupy little space in relation to that of the large figures. Figure 56. The large figure scenes in room after room of Pepi H's temple must have been awe-inspiring, and it is possible that a development toward large figure temple reliefs that began here influenced much later relief decoration in temples of the Middle and New Kingdoms. 52 In the framework of the history of Old Kingdom relief composition, however, these large figure scenes are strongly reminiscent of early 4th dynasty compositions, figure 50, and appear to indicate artistic tendencies in royal relief art at the end of the Old Kingdom. 53 The scheme of a large focal figure with rows of smaller ones having lost its appeal. Artists must have looked back to the earlier type of composition, undoubtedly because it was more appropriate for changed views of the function of the pyramid temple and its reliefs. Ensembles of royal reliefs in their architectural settings. Any speculation about the function and significance of pyramid temple reliefs is, of course, closely linked to general questions concerning the function of the temples and their various rooms. In the 1940s and 1950s, Rick and Schott maintained that the buildings of Old Kingdom pyramid complexes were predominantly stages and sets for royal funerals. 54 But wall reliefs of the buildings providing no support for such an interpretation. Beginning in the 1970s, scholars therefore reconsidered the function of pyramid complexes, paying more attention to the content of the reliefs. 55 It is now argued that the royal funeral, a single event whose renewal and perpetuity would have little significance, had at best only an indirect impact on a temple's architecture and reliefs. Our present understanding is that most scenes either perpetuated the rituals and offerings that ensured the king's eternal life or evoked and magically strengthened the power of kingship and its victory over chaos. It is important to note how differently designers treated these ideas in each complex. A brief description of a walk through a pyramid complex with relatively well-preserved reliefs will convey the general sense of one such design. Like most of its kind, the pyramid complex of Kingsar at Abu Sir, figures 57, 58, Cat. No. Uo, consisted of a valley temple, causeway, pyramid temple, pyramid, and secondary, smaller, pyramid. At the valley temple, which could be understood as a quayside Egyptian place, reliefs depicted marshlands, the environment of the valley temple and a traditional Egyptian symbol of rebirth. 56 And the arrival of a large royal ship accompanied by running troops, Cat. Number 114. 57 Other reliefs appear to have served as a preparation for what would be shown in greater detail in the pyramid temple itself. Among these preparatory representations are depictions of the king in the presence of major deities and scenes from the Heb. 58 One impressive relief shows the young pharaoh suckled by a goddess. 59 The last scene is documented in the exhibition by a similar block from the valley temple of King User, Cat. No. N8. On the north wall of the valley temple's two-columned hall, in front of the niche doorway, large griffins, the mythical embodiments of kingship, trampled on enemies 60 while deities led bound prisoners toward them. The scenes of bound prisoners were repeated on the causeway walls just behind the valley temple. 61 Emphasizing movement from valley temple to causeway and farther on to the pyramid temple. 62 Recently excavated reliefs from the upper part of Sur's causeway depict men bearing offerings, butchers slaughtering animals, and a building crew bringing the gilded capstone to the pyramid amid festivities connected with the event. Also represented are emaciated desert people, a possible reference to the mountainous area from which the pyramid capstone came. For a later example, see Cat. Number 122. Scenes referring to the construction of the pyramid complex. 64 may be regarded as elaborations of earlier reliefs in which the temple foundation was depicted in connection with the Heb. From the causeway one entered the first room of the pyramid temple, a long vaulted hall, called the Perweru, House of the Great Ones, in ancient Egyptian. This room is thought to have been a copy of a hall in the living king's residence where he received notables and performed certain rituals. 66 The position and shape of the Perweru in 5th and 6th dynasty pyramid temples are strikingly like those of the entrance corridor and the temple of Safru, in which rows of estate personifications appeared in the bottom registers of wall reliefs. Fragments of similar reliefs were found in Sar's Perweru, but it is not known what ritual scenes, if any, made up the rest of the decoration. The perwero opens into the column courtyard that is the central feature of the outer part of the pyramid temple. Sur's courtyard, surrounded by corridors on all four sides, is different from those of other pyramid temples. The courtyard, its porticos, and its outer walls have the character of a closed architectural block. Representations of ships were carved on the west walls of the eastern corridor 68 and on the east walls of the western corridor 69, indicating that the courtyard block should be understood as an island surrounded by water. In Egyptian mythology, the creation of the world began with the emergence of an island from the primeval water, and thus the courtyard island of Sur becomes analogous to the first created land. The palm capitals of the portico columns allude to the plants on the primeval island. 70 Inside the corridors on the north and south faces of the courtyard block, ritual scenes were depicted. They showed dancing, music making, and the bringing of offering animals into the presence of large figures of the king and certain deities. 71 Scenes from the B.C.E may also have been included. 72 All these ritualistic images underline the sacred nature of the island. The corridor walls opposite the island block were carved with magnificent relief compositions showing the king hunting in the desert, cat. Number 113, and in the marshes. 73 Such royal occupations traditionally symbolize the king's struggle against the forces of chaos and the triumph of life over death. 74 Their depictions served to avert evil from the primeval island and all that happened there. The events that were believed to occur in a symbolic way on the island were shown in the portico reliefs facing the open court. On the southern and northern portico walls the king was depicted subjugating enemies on Egypt's western, Libyan 75 and eastern, Asiatic 76 borders and taking large numbers of their cattle and other domestic animals. On the western portico walls more scenes from the HEB were depicted. 77 The paramount theme of Egyptian kingship was expressed in reliefs decorating the alabaster altar in the courtyard center, which depicted the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt accompanied by fertility figures. 78 Thus through its relief decoration the primeval island at the center of Sur's pyramid temple became a stage for the king's enactment of his quintessential role as guarantor of order and prosperity. Through repeated emphasis on this role's cosmic significance, the king's deeds were interpreted as the fulfillment of creation. At this point it may be telling to compare the courtyard of the Temple of Pepi II, figure 59, with that in the Temple of Sur. In Pepi's courtyard no reliefs adorn the portico walls, and scenes found in and around the courtyard block in Sur's temple appear in other rooms of Pepi II's temple. 80 Without doubt these differences in relief position express a changed concept of kingship and the religious ideas surrounding it. Sur was regarded as a hero who performed deeds to ensure stability and abundance, while in the large figure reliefs of his pyramid temple Pepi II is primarily a performer of rituals and a companion of the gods. In Sur's temple an impressive desert hunt is depicted, but in Pepi II's temple the triumph over evil is represented by a scene of the ritual killing of a single antelope. 81 Evidently the designers of the Pepi II complex no longer regarded the pyramid temple courtyard as a place where kingship triumphant was made manifest. They decorated the pillars of the courtyard porticos with double figure groups showing Pepi embraced by gods. 82 And left the rest of the walls undecorated. A central doorway in the corridor west of Sur's courtyard led into a hall with 5 statue chambers. The statues of the king in these 5 chambers received a daily cult and were thus a primary ritual focus, as they were in all pyramid temples. See Old Kingdom statues in their architectural setting by Dieter Arnold in this catalogue. The hall of statue chambers and all rooms that opened from it including the sanctuary for the mortuary cult were situated at a higher level than the rest of the temple, a fact that emphasized their greater importance. 83 Two massive walls flank the central entrance into the statue hall, creating a deep recess for the doorway and transforming it into the typical niche doorway that Ray called the door of the goddess, Nut. 84 An important secondary entrance south of the center courtyard led directly from the open desert into rooms that connected with the secondary pyramid of the king to the south and with the western courtyard corridor to the north. An impressive relief that flanked this entrance, Cat. No. R3, depicted deities and beneficial spirits endowing the king with prosperity, stability, and eternal rule. Reliefs in the rooms behind the side entrance showed the king worshipping the lion-headed goddess Bastet. 85 Allusions to this goddess may also be found in a monumental statue of a lion or lioness that stood in the pyramid temple of King Usur in a small recess beside the niche central doorway, or door of Nut. 86 Female deities, Nekbet and Bastet or Sakmet, played an important role in the relief decoration of all niche central doorways in Old Kingdom pyramid temples. In the Temple of Sur, a large human-headed goddess suckling the young king must have been depicted on the walls flanking the doorway, as well as in the similarly shaped entrance from the Valley Temple into the causeway. 87. The parallel image from the Valley Temple of Nusur, Cat. No. R8, showed the goddess with a lion head. The impressive images of the king being nurtured by a goddess can be regarded as a proclamation of the king's eternal rebirth. For the statues inside the 5 chambers behind the central courtyard, the niche doorway functioned as a kind of birth canal, through which the king, after being revived by the statue called, stepped down into the courtyard to perform his heroic deeds. 88 Papyri tell us that in Neferkar's pyramid temple the central statue of 5 represented the king as Osiris, the foremost Egyptian resurrection deity, while the 2 outermost ones depicted him as king of Upper and Lower Egypt. 89 The most important record of the appearance of statues in pyramid temple statue chambers is found in a relief from the temple of King Nusur, figure 5-5. Which shows the enthroned king being presented with thanks by Anubis, the necropolis god. Small discs at the bottom of the throne may depict rollers on which the statue was moved from its niche during ritual performances. 90 The praence of both Osiris and Anubis is a reminder that, despite the great emphasis on kingship in general, a pyramid temple is always dedicated to a deceased king. Storerooms were located on both sides of the 5-chambered hall. These contained the implements and provisions necessary for ritual performances. Reliefs in the corridors leading to these rooms depicted how such objects were packed and handled. Sealing a box containing incense is written above one scene. 91 And the presentation of gold to officials is shown in the corridor leading to storerooms in the north. 92 An area of solid stone separated 93 the mortuary cult sanctuary from these storerooms, the statue chambers, and the rest of the temple. 94 Although a mortuary cult chamber was not part of 4th dynasty pyramid temples, it may have been introduced into royal funerary architecture. 95 Only under influences from tombs of non-royal persons. 96 By the time of King Sihir the room was certainly a place of important ritual performances that ensured the king's eternal life. 97 The reliefs in this room were more standardized than any others in the temple and did not differ essentially from reliefs in the mortuary cult chambers of non-royal persons. A long list of offerings was usually shown in front of the seated king on both long walls of the chamber. Rows of offering bearers moved toward the pharaoh, and there were depictions of a rich display of goods piled on tables. Compare Cat. Number 194. On the back wall of False Sur, the traditional place of communication between the living and the dead was surrounded by fertility figures and deities. Sur's pyramid temple had relief decoration on almost 400 running meters of wall space, constituting the largest program of its kind. Calculations involving monuments from Khufu's statue cult temple to the pyramid temple of Pepi II show that the amount of wall space suitable for relief decoration in pyramid temples gradually increased until it reached this peak and then decreased, as the following table indicates. These necessarily very rough calculations not only underline the singular richness of the Sur relief decoration 100 but also show the close link between the development of relief decoration and of architecture during the Pyramid Age. Each increase in available wall space must have spurred the relief designers to create yet more elaborate scenes, and each new pictorial elaboration must have been a challenge to the architects to provide more space. The human image in Old Kingdom non-royal reliefs. When Van Eyck or Titian painted the portrait of a bourgeois or grandee of his day, several factors entered into the compositine of the picture: the painter's own personality, the patron's desire to be depicted more or less realistically, and a third consideration of which neither was completely aware: the political, economic, and geographic conditions in which they lived. The influence of each of these factors is what makes the portraits of Van Eyck and Titian, as individual as they are, recognizably different from each other. When an Egyptian sculptor decorated the walls of a mastaba with the likeness of a dignitary, someone who had attained sufficient status and wealth to commission a tomb with relief decoration, the same three factors doubtless also entered into the equation and could involve in turn the artist's vision, the subject's expectations, or the atmosphere of their times. After the pharaoh himself, the owners of mastabas embodied the human ideal in the Old Kingdom. It is possible to determine what the concept of the individual was in this era by examining several aspects of the human figure as it appears in relief. The interest in facial features, or realistic portraiture. To the extent that portraiture, as we understand it today, existed at all in royal sculpture during the different periods of Egyptian history, one we may reasonably ask if it might not have existed in non-royal images as well. The only way to assess the degree of realism that sculptors of the Old Kingdom achieved in the depiction of faces is to note whether a particular facial feature is limited to a single representation or is common to all those in the tomb. Facial expressions. These are another index of individual personality or social groups. This is clearly the feature that changes the least in Old Kingdom reliefs, in contrast to sculpture in the round, where there is a world of difference between a wood statue of Merir Ha-Ishitef, 6th dynasty, 2 in the Sheikh Elbulb, probably 4th dynasty, figure 34, 3 the former with its fluid, almost feminine in fact, man-nurse pose in the latter with its characteristic stoutness and nascent hyperrealism. Even in relief, however, subtle differences reflect the transition from one reign to the next. The interest in anatomy, or modeling, in the outline of a human figure as well as its surface. For since the face and legs almost always present a minimum of relief, it is appropriate to speak of an interest in anatomy only when the modeling extends to other parts of the body. Only first-rate monuments for which we also have photographs of the same level of quality allow us to appreciate these numerous stylistic variations. 5 To complete the picture of the masculine and feminine ideals in the Old Kingdom, it is also a good idea to complement the study of style with a consideration of the variations that occur in the layout of portraits of couples. 6 These variations doubtless have more to do with the evolution of conventions for portraying the human figure than with the evolution of the society's mentality, but they help to recreate the image of a society, just as portraits of couples or groups do in Dutch painting of the 17th century. Not all of the non-royal monuments of the Old Kingdom have yet been precisely dated. 7 For that reason, the sketch that follows, done in rather broad strokes, should be considered incomplete and provisional. For the pure pose of this discussion I have adopted a chronological approach, from the 3rd through the 6th dynasty. The 3rd dynasty. Reliefs from the 3rd dynasty are rare, but the 422 preservation of 2 monuments of exceptional quality allows us to see how the officials of that time chose to have themselves represented for eternity. These are the mastaba of Hesi-Re, on the one hand, 8 and that of Ka-Bau-Sakar and his wife, Hathor-Nefer-Hotep, on the other. 9 The first of these 2 men was greatest of the king's scribes and chief of dentists, the second, overseer of works in the necropolis, which put the best artisans at his disposal, and priest of Seshet and Anubis as well as other deities. 10 The mastaba of Hesi-Re most likely dates to the reign of Djoser, since the last basket of earth excavated from its burial chamber, and therefore probably from the floor of the tomb, contained 2 jars purse with seal impressions in that king's name. 11 The mastaba of Ka-Bau-Sakar might be a little later than that of Hesi-Re, although it is not certain that the observable differences between the 2 monuments should be attributed solely to the passage of time. 12 In this period the representation of couples did not yet exist. Hesi-Re is always shown without a wife, while Ka-Bau-Sakar and Hathor-Nefer-Hotep have separate chapels. In the case of Ka-Bau-Sakar, what first strikes the observer is the impression of physical force, of raw power exuded by the deceased's profile and the side walls of his limestone niche. 13 The torso is heavy, not with the puffy fat that would often be seen later, in the 6th dynasty, but with a heaviness more indicative of aged flesh. The legs are as massive as the rest of the profile. 14 The sculptor, perhaps at the behest of his patron, has rendered the details of the musculature and bones of this heavy body with such delight and care that he has made of it a veritable anatomical chart. 15 The most remarkable features are the indications of the back of the knee. 16 And the ilium, hip bone. 17 I know of no other Old Kingdom relief that shows the first detail. The latter appears only rarely in mastaba reliefs but is visible here even transparently, under the cloak that Ka-Bau-Sakar wears on the back wall of the niche. No smile lights up the face of this official. Instead, the eyes are small, one might even say sly, with large bags beneath them. The nose is short and bent, with a marked bump on the bridge. The lips are thick, the lower one decidedly more advanced. 18 In a way, the harshness of this face reflects that of the body. The whole is realized with a sense of meticulousness surprising for such a remote period, a quality that characterizes not only the anatomy but also the locks of the wig. 19 The pattern of the kilt, the minuscule folds of skin surrounding the nails. 20 In the hieroglyphic signs. Yet this is not really astonishing. The most realistic and detailed works are generally found at the birth of a civilization or the beginning of an artist's career. Simplification and stylization come only later. Thus, the first tree drawn by Mondrian and the first bull rendered by Picasso are each absolutely realistic. The more Mondrian would draw trees and Picasso bulls, the less would these be easily identifiable as such. Eventually, the tree and the bull would become hardly recognizable, as the work of the two painters neared pure abstraction. In contrast to her husband, Hathor-Nefer-Hotep is spectacularly slender. Her thinness is visible over all 21 and particularly in the arms and fingers, as well as in her dried-up face, where it is expressed by prominent cheekbones in a work in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, CG 1386, figure 60. It is also visible in the aged breast, whose nipple points downward and rests on the forearm in another relief in Cairo, CG 1387, exactly as that ophlysis does centuries later on the first pylon at Philae, 22 there, however, reflecting the weight of the flesh. In any case, nothing here, in the Third Dynasty, anticipates the round, firm breast that would be part of the feminine canon of the Old Kingdom. 23 For this is a woman who is meant to be shown as aged, or at least following the example of her husband as mature. The face of Hathor-Nefer-Hotep is even less attractive than that of Ka-Bau-Sakar. It may seem more marked by time on CG 1386 than on CG 1387, because of the collapse of the flesh above the cheekbones, certain African traits, and a disagreeable disposition, yet on both walls we see the same turned-up nose, double chin, and jutting lower jaw. But the most extraordinary aspect of Hathor-Nefer-Hotep's reliefs is certainly that of their modeling. No other female body in the Old Kingdom is treated with such concern for anatomical realism. 24 Although the male profile would always be the object of a certain anatomical interest, sometimes minor or minimal, sometimes more developed, nothing has been omitted. 25 Not even the iliac crest or the modeling of the abdomen. 26 Two details exceptional in bas-reliefs. 27 The form of Hathor-Nefer-Hotep's belly, two ridges on either side of the navel, which are separated from the pubic region by a flat area, is especially significant. There are a number of conventions for representing the female abdomen, and this one is exactly paralleled by an example in the statue of Nessa, cat. Number 13, which dates precisely to the same period as the reliefs of Hathor-Nefer-Hotep. On the 5 wood panels discovered in the niches of Hesi-Ri's tomb and now on display in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, the face of the deceased is consistently that of a mature man, sour and sullen. This disagreeable expression even appears in panel CG 1430, cat. Number 17, in which Hesi-Ri is shown as much younger. The narrow eyes, at times almost closed, seem to express cunning. The turned-down corners of the lips, rimmed and delicate, are hardly appealing. The raised chin gives its owner an air of complete arrogance. The impression of age is best seen on panel CG 1426, where the face is most deeply furrowed and creased, with wrinkles extending from the inner canthus of the eye and the base of the nose, framing and setting off the chin, figure 61. The strong, aquiline nose, repeated systematically from one relief to the next, also serves clearly to make these true portraits. There seems to be an undeniable parallelism between the facial treatment of Hesi-Ri, or of Ka-Bau-Sakar and his wife, and that of the royal portraits of the time. They display the same sternness, or in any case, the same seriousness of expression and the same realism, the strong, hooked nose and jutting jaw of Djoser, both in his reliefs and in his statue. 28 The thick nose and narrow eye of Horus Khajet, cat. Number 9, the beaked nose, slanted and barely open eye, and fully averted lips of Zanyakt. Another remarkable feature displayed in Hesi-Ri's mastaba is the deceased penchant, or that of his sculptor, for depictions of anatomy. The panel that best illustrates this is CG 1427, which Richer used in his study of the Newton art, 30 as much for the exhaustiveness of its anatomical description as for its great exactitude. As in the reliefs of Ka-Bau-Sakar, the hip bone is shown and can even be discerned under the cloak worn by the deceased. In comparison to Ka-Bau-Sakar, Hesi-Ri is quite slender, and this slimness is equally visible in the objects that surround him, the Medu staff and Sekhem scepter, the leg of the offering table, and the hieroglyphic signs. This is the artist's choice, one that can be compared with the treatment of the human figure in Dirk Poutz's Trial of Otho. In the figure of Hesi-Ri seated at the offering table, his legs may be characterized as more gaunt than slender. The Fourth Dynasty. With the reign of Senfru, the style of the previous dynasty relaxes. In contrast with the wish of nobles in the Third Dynasty to have themselves represented at an advanced stage of their career and with pitiless realism, several contemporaries of the first king of the Fourth Dynasty appear in relief with a demeanor that is particularly youthful and pleasant, even sweet. This is especially the case with Mechen, cat. Number 29, 33 Necho Perf, 34 Nahet Hotep, Saqqara A1, 35 but it is true as well for Nefer, 36 Ra-Hotep, 37 and Ahed Aa, cat. Number 18. 38. The smooth surface of the figures in the mastabas of these officials is intentional on the part of the artist. Modeling was apparently of no interest at this time. Variations in the perfectly flat surface are rare and extremely subtle. In the relief of Ahed Hotep now in the Brooklyn Museum, 57.178, they are limited to summary indications of the collarbone, left biceps, and right elbow and to even more superficial modeling on the lower limbs. But the thickness of the relief is rarely so spectacular in the Old Kingdom as it is here, so much so that Marriott described the decoration of Ahed Hotep's mastaba as sculpture in the round. Figure 64. 39. This is something extremely rare in Egyptian art, where relief is, by nature, rather thin. 40. The proportions of the figures of the deceased are often massive, particularly in the legs. The sole exception to this state of affairs is found in the tablet of Ra-Hotep's false door, British Museum, London, 1242, in which the abnormal slenderness of the legs is exactly in the spirit of the Third Dynasty, as are two other details, the chair seat shown from above, which disappears completely after King Khufu. 41. And the sculptor's unusual interest in anatomy, expressed here in the neck muscle, the sternocleidomastoid, the collarbone, the lower ribs, the deltoid shoulder muscle, the muscles of the forearm extended toward the offering table, the hip bone showing under the cloak, as rare as the two sharply differentiated knees, the fibula, and the ankle bone. All this suggests that the tablet of Ra-Hotep's false door, which looks quite isolated with respect to the rest of the tomb walls, was carved before the other walls or by an artist rooted in the past. From Sefru to Khufu there is not much change in the depiction of the human figure, except in the thickness of the relief, which passes abruptly from exceptionally high to much lower raised relief. The latter, in fact, sometimes even comes close to the kind of low relief found on modern coins or medals, as in the slab stele from Giza, cat. Numbers 5153, or the relief from the tomb of El-Arri. 42. Despite long-standing opinion, non-royal monuments of the 4th dynasty are quite numerous, enough so that they may be counted by the dozens. Several of them have simply been attributed wrongly to the 6th dynasty. 43. A good example of relief in the 4th dynasty is found in the mastaba of Khufu Khaf, G 7140. 44. The tomb owner was probably a son of Khufu, perhaps even the same man as the future pharaoh Khafra. 45. For whom the mastaba had been prepared before his accession to the throne. In the reliefs of his imposing tomb, located in the eastern cemetery of Giza, the figures of Khufu Khaf strike the visitor both by their exceptional height and by their marvelous workmanship. The most representative scene shows the official and his wife with their arms entwined, turning to the left to receive offering bearers and scribes. Figure 65. 46. The key characteristics of the two figures here are the lack of expression and the nearly total absence of individuality in their faces. 47. Qualities so marked that they almost call to mind the classicism of ancient Greece. Just as in Greek classicism, the man has an athletic physique, with a thin waist, well-proportioned shoulders, and strong legs. Another characteristic this time in contrast to Greek classicism, which sought to emphasize anatomy, is the absence of modeling to animate Khufu Khaf's exemplary silhouette. He is a cartoon cutout, in which the muscles of the forward arm and forearm are barely perceptible. 48. This indifference to anatomy is certainly not due to a lack of means. Instead, it reflects a particular vision of the human being, since in the same tomb the hieroglyphs are executed with precision and an incomparable refinement. Although their faces show no sentiment, the figures of the couple themselves are arranged with a touching intimacy. The pose of Khufu Khaf's wife, Nefret Kau, has nothing conventional about it. In Old Kingdom reliefs the wife normally puts her arm around her husband's neck. 49. But here Nefret Kau holds onto her husband's arm, looping her own arm about that of Khufu Khaf and putting her other hand on his wrist, actually snuggling up against him. 50. There is no way of knowing whether the official himself or the artist who designed his chapel's reliefs was the one who took the initiative in showing conjugal tenderness with such starring. Be that as it may, the period itself doubtless also played a part. Such freedom of expression could have existed only when the rules of composition had not yet been set into a fixed routine. 51. The dominant features of Khufu Khaf's relief reappear in most 4th dynasty mastabas. Faces with little individuality but often rather youthful features, which is a means of idealizing the deceased, serene, smiling, or even blissful expressions, and a general lack of interest in it not only all serve to make the figures of the officials depicted in these monuments representations that are timeless in character. 52 Noteworthy in this respect are the grace and striking youthfulness in the face of Neferi, figure 62, even at the peak of his career, when he has a flabby chest and pot belly, 53 or the ravishing smile of Merib, figure 63, at the beginning of the 4th dynasty. It is hard not to see these images as comparable to the statue of Ra-Her-Ka and Mercy Ankh as it appears on the cover of the recent catalogue devoted to Old Kingdom statuary in the Louvre, with its chief characteristic a kind of faith in the future illuminating the faces of the official and his wife. 54 Considering the harsh facsimiles of nobles of the 3rd dynasty, we can only wonder what might explain this new direction in the 4th dynasty's concept of the individual. Is it the expression of political and social well-being, or simply a reaction against the art of the preceding period? Or are we to see in the use of the same mold for everyone the desire to leave no place for the individual? 55 This overall picture of the 4th dynasty has to be amended somewhat, because not all the officials of that time are shown with angelic faces or innocuous features. Seneca, G2041, for example, has a big nose, fat lips, and a double chin and is neither smiling nor youthful. 56 Nefer, G21 Row, is famous for his raptor's beak of a nose, which occurs both in his reliefs, cat. Number 79, and his magic head, usually called reserve head, and for his double chin. 57 As for the woman named David, British Museum, London, A157A, an appellation meaning female hippopotamus, which she can hardly have received by chance. Her bovine neck, short and quite pointed nose, little eyes, and wasteless body all give her a very individual appeal. There are also exceptions in the use of modeling. On the false door jamb of Uri, British Museum, London, 1168-59 and the false door tablet of Hudi, cat. Number 85, 6 degrees. The normal cookie-cutter aspect of the foreground is relieved by modeling atypical of the 4th dynasty in the case of Uri, even despite the thinness of the relief. In Hudi's relief the representation of the iliac bone, added to that of numerous other anatomical details, leads me to believe that this mastaba is nearer in time to the 3rd dynasty than I have argued elsewhere. It could date to the beginning of Khufu's reign rather than to the time of Jafar. The 5th dynasty. On the whole, the faces of the 5th dynasty are much more mature and more austere than those of the 4th dynasty. Youth, smiles, and amiability have disappeared for most of them, figure 66, notably because of a small fold that descends from the wing of the nose, beginning, apparently, in the reign of Userkov 62 or a very typical wrinkling of the nostril. 63 In addition to their greater maturity, these faces are often quite individual. The official Nefer Tenef, in whose mastaba the name of King Neferkar appears, has a very large nose that favors him not at all. 64 Ka-M Nefret, whose mastaba preserves the name of King User, has a puffy face, with bags under the eyes, thick, rimmed lips, and a double chin, figure 67. In the 5th dynasty the philtrum, the furrow that joins the upper lip to the nose, also called for that reason the nasolabial furrow, is quite regularly indicated. 65 It can be found as early as the 3rd dynasty, in the reliefs of Hesi-Re, but it is virtually if not entirely absent in the 4th dynasty. The lips are generally rimmed. 66 At the end of the 5th dynasty this even includes the corners of the mouth, as would normally be the case later, in the 6th dynasty. 67 Although this is entirely at odds with physical reality. These diverse indications of folds in the skin, the rimmed lips, the philtrum, the fold extending from the wing of the nose, should probably be seen as part of the extraordinary feeling for modeling and, therefore, the taste for realistic anatomical detail that characterizes the rest of the depictions of the human figure in the 5th dynasty, despite the extreme thinness of the relief. 68 This is another area in which the 5th dynasty distances itself from the 4th. Good examples of this interest in anatomy can be found in the mastabas of T, Saqqara D22, 69 Niang Khnum and Khnum Hotep, King Muni's Causeway, 7 degrees Hetep Arakti, Rijksmuseum van Oudheden, Leiden, 1904 71 Monefer, Egyptisches Museum und Papiersammlung, Berlin, UO8, 72 Mechaji, Cat. Numbers 151 to 156, and the two Ahed Hoteps, Louvre, Paris, E10958,73 Saqqara D6474. In some mastabas even secondary figures receive meticulously detailed anatomical rendering. 75 All these examples come from Saqqara, At Giza in the same period the reliefs are generally void of modeling, because the local limestone, of poor quality, does not permit the same surface treatment. Among the mastabas of the 5th dynasty, the funerary complexity 64 at Saqqara seems to me to be the work of an exceptional artist, both for the stunning quality of its reliefs and for their style. This complex comprises 3 chapels, 2 in the name of Hotep and the 3rd dedicated to his son, Hotep, on whose walls the latest royal name is that of Sisi, the next to last king of the 5th dynasty. A prime example of the artist's skill can be seen in the chapel of Hotep, where the scene of hunting in the desert, with its pictorial sense and the finesse of its details, and the still life of the pile of offerings to the right of the deceased's table are both virtuoso performances. The last is a sheer visual delight, forming a kind of picture within a picture, since the sculptor has executed it on a level different from that of the rest of the scene. As depicted in the chapel, the figures of Hotep himself, handsome and tall in stature, are elegant and alluring. Mastaba D64 has no parallel in any other 5th dynasty mastabas, and particularly not in those with the name of Sisi, such as the mastaba of Monnefer, Saqqara H2. Hotep's relief is markedly thicker and rounder than that of Monnefer. The deceased's face contains no individual traits, no mark of age, neither wrinkling of the nostril nor fold along the nose, and no trace of severity. On the contrary, it breathes youthfulness and exudes great sweetness, essentially owing to the wide-open eyes and delicately rounded cheeks. Figure 70. To all appearances it is an idealized face, but one that differs from the idealizations of the 4th dynasty in the full curves of the relief. These characteristics of Hotep's reliefs prefigure aspects of 6th dynasty examples, as do the strongly angular knees of the deceased when he is shown seated. 77 I have suggested elsewhere that the 2 chapels of Hotep date to the reign of Isi, the last king mentioned on its walls. Because of the shape of the chair cushions represented there. 78 It is more difficult to date the chapel of Hotep exactly, because I do not know of any iconographic criterion precise enough to permit a distinction between the end of the 5th dynasty and the beginning of the 6th. Everything I have noted above concerning the style of these reliefs leads one to think of the time of Teti rather than the reign of Isi. Nonetheless, I believe that if Hotep, who served in the cults of 3 successive rulers, Nisr, Menkaure, and Isi, had also been in service under Isi's successor, Unis, he would not have failed to note this on the walls of his tomb. 79 Consequently, I am tempted to believe that the decoration of Hotep's chapel itself is contemporary with Isi, but that it is the work of an innovative sculptor ahead of his time, which is to say an artist truly out of the ordinary. With regard to the arrangement of the portraits of couples, a new convention was occasionally adopted in the 5th dynasty. The wife is no longer shown on the same scale as her husband, but at approximately half his size. This technique, which had appeared as a short-lived experiment in the mastabas of Hotep and Nefermat at Meidum, under Sinfru, 80 recurs most notably in the combs of T. Sr Nefer Irtenef, 82 Nefer and Kahe, 83 in Patashepses. The 6th dynasty. It is more difficult to determine the ideal vision of man and woman for the nobles of the 6th dynasty, since outside the reign of Teti there are fewer great mastabas and fewer large-scale representations of the deceased than in preceding dynasties. Non-royal monuments from the exceptionally long reign of Pepi II, at least 64 years 85 are limited primarily to false doors, whose representations of officials are often less than meticulously sculpted. Larger private monuments can be found outside the Memphite necropolis, but good photographs of these are rare. In mastabas with the names of Teti or Pepi we continue to see the stylistic features already attested in the chapel of Hotep but more marked than before, fairly thick and often full relief. 86 very angular knees when the deceased is seated, 87 quite large eyes, 88 round cheeks, 89 in rimmed lips with the rim extending on the corners of the mouth, 9 degrees as well as an amiable, even smiling, expression. Figures 68, 69. 91 Some officials, such as Izzy, Louvre, Paris, E14 329. 92 also have a large mouth and a stiff, almost mannered pose. 93 others have a nose that descends directly from the forehead. 94 The large eyes and mouth are expressionistic distortions that are also to be found in the statuary of the same period. Finally, what distinguishes the smiling faces of the 6th dynasty from those of the 4th are essentially the fullness of the relief and the less youthful appearance of the faces. The taste for modeling is a highly variable element. In the 6th dynasty, The relief is generally quite far removed from the splendid mechanics of the 3rd and 5th dynasties, although quite detailed anatomical representations do appear occasionally. 95 The deceased is frequently represented on the pillars and door reveals of the tomb, as if preparing to leave it, with full belly and sagging breasts, that is, in the twilight of life. In portraits of couples, the wife is sometimes shown at a realistic scale with respect to her husband, but occasionally she is miniaturized beside the deceased as a sort of hieroglyph or image for the record. 96 This technique had already appeared in statuary of the 5th dynasty, 97, but only rarely in relief of the same period. From this survey it would appear that changes in the concept of the individual, as evidenced by the walls of mastabas, were primarily a function of the spirit of the times, since each dynasty shows a new type of the male and the female figure. This does not, however, preclude the possibility that the tastes of particular individuals, artists, or patrons could have overridden the current climate at any given moment during the Old Kingdom. What seems most striking to me is how the faces of the mastaba owners fall into groups dynasty by dynasty, both in their expressions and in their realism, or lack of it. The severity of faces in the 3rd dynasty contrasts clearly with the optimism of those in the 4th dynasty, just as the maturity and austerity of 5th dynasty faces contrast with the youthfulness of 4th dynasty portraits and the serene or smiling fullness of those in the 6th dynasty. Style thus becomes a very concrete and reliable means of dating a relief, although it must remain a supplementary criterion. In matters of style we are always at the mercy of the sculptor's imagination, or that of his model. For that reason it is best to continue classifying the non-royal monuments of the Old Kingdom first of all by criteria less dependent on subjectivity, such as the shape of a chair leg or the length of a necklace. 99 It is not impossible that one day a finer stylistic analysis will enable us to date mastaba reliefs reign by reign and not merely dynasty by dynasty, or even to identify particular artists, in the same way that we can easily recognize today the hand of Van Eyck or Titian. Furniture of the Old Kingdom. Carpentry and furniture manufacture were among the earliest trades plied in ancient Egypt, and by the Old Kingdom woodworking had become a well-developed craft practiced by accomplished artisans. The elegant furniture found within the 4th dynasty tomb of Queen Hetep attests to the high level of craftsmanship that had been attained into a skilled tradition of woodworking, which made it one of the most significant Egyptian minor arts. The discovery of this remarkable tomb not only provided tangible examples demonstrating the advanced technical prowess of Egyptian carpenters, but also opened a unique window into the Old Kingdom through which we might better understand the domestic lifestyle and household goods of the ancient Egyptians. Depictions of furniture and statuary, tomb paintings, and reliefs expand and enhance our knowledge of the development of the craft and, as comparatively few examples of Old Kingdom furniture have survived to the present day, must be the source of much of our information on the subject. Most of this material, whether artifactual or pictorial, originated in royal or nobles' tombs. The materials and types of Old Kingdom furniture. Wood was the material most commonly employed for furniture construction, but ivory, stone, metal, and wicker were also utilized on occasion. The wood available in Egypt is poor in quality and limited in quantity, circumstances that make the development of a highly skilled carpentry trade striking. Although the identification of wood species has often been overlooked during artifact analyses, we know that some indigenous trees used by furniture makers from the pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom included acacia, tamarisk, willow, sycamore, date palm, poplar, and cedar. It is possible that carob, fig, dune palm, and persea were also employed, because they are either mentioned in inscriptions or supplied fruits that have been found in early tombs. The lack of superior wood in Egypt made its importation imperative. Thus cedar, cypress, fir, pine, yew, and perhaps also birch were transported from the area of Syria and Lebanon, while ebony was brought in from regions to the south of Egypt, particularly the Sudan and Ethiopia. One evidence that Egyptians imported wood appears on the Palermo stone, Cat. No. RR5, which records that during the 4th dynasty King Senfru sent 40 ships to acquire cedar from Lebanon. This inscription not only tells us that wood was imported but also suggests that good quality timber, and particularly cedar, was an important and highly valued commodity in the culture of ancient Egypt. Although there is a paucity of extant examples, the evolution of furniture can be traced from the pre-dynastic and archaic periods, which precede the Old Kingdom, on the basis of the sparse evidence that does survive. Preserved by the arid environment, the First Dynasty tombs at Abydos have yielded remains of wood furniture, often decorated with basketry motifs and ivory inlays. hippopotamus and elephant ivories, finely carved in the shape of bulls' legs, that were used as furniture supports too have been unearthed, and similarly wrought wood exemplars have also been discovered. The base of each leg, beneath the carved bull's hoof, terminates in a ribbed cylinder designed to protect the foot of the support. Furniture legs continue to be finished with pedestal feet of this kind even after the Old Kingdom. Many well-preserved pieces of early furniture were found by W.M.F. Petrie at the Upper Egyptian site of Tarkhan. 3 there. Within the First Dynasty mastaba tombs, he discovered small, simple tables, trays, and 4 different types of bed frame and assemblage that supplies valuable insight into the practices of daily life and the sort of furniture in common use in pre-dynastic and archaic times. The bed frames vary in style from very simple objects, constructed from 4 fortuitously bent tree branches, to complex examples. The latter display a high degree of woodworking prowess, as the carved rails are often finished with papyrus-shaped terminals and the heavy bovine legs are attached to them by lashing and mortise and tendon joints. Most beds were inclined slightly from the head down toward the foot. Interestingly, no stools or chairs were discovered at Tarkhan. However, several examples are illustrated in Second Dynasty tomb stele from the 1.4. Finely detailed wall paintings uncovered by James Quibell in 19 within the Third Dynasty mastaba of Hesi-Re at Saqqara 5 depict a considerable quantity of household furniture and other furnishings for use by the tomb owner in the afterlife. Among the goods illustrated are numerous bed frames, stools, chairs, chests, tables, game boxes, and headrests, all items that would typically have equipped a noble's home. In comparison with the preceding archaic period furniture, these exhibit more refined design and carpentry techniques and a strikingly wider variety of styles and models. Particularly notable is the range of box and chest types, each of which may have served a different function. The Hesi-Re paintings suggest not only an evolution of this kind but also that inlays, gilding, paint, and imported woods were being used by the Third Dynasty and that the basic conventions, traditions, and forms governing Egyptian furniture production had been established by this time. This development is corroborated by 11 beautifully carved wood panels discovered in Hesi-Re's mastaba by Auguste Mariette during the mid-19th century. These show Hesi-Re in raised relief assuming a variety of poses with refined furnishings of various kinds. For example, in one panel he is seated upon a bovine or gazelle-legged stool in front of a table. Cat. Number 17. The funerary assemblage of Queen Hetepheres I, wife of Snefru, the first ruler of the Fourth Dynasty, was discovered in 1925 by George Reisner. 6 This rare archaeological find lay in a small room at the bottom of a deep shaft near the pyramid of the Queen's son Khufu at Giza. Among the grave goods was a collection of royal furniture including a bed, a portable canopy, several boxes, 2 chairs, and a carrying chair. Cat. Number 33. Many objects were inlaid and covered with gold foil, but unfortunately much of the original wood had deteriorated, leaving gilding and inlay fragments on the floor. Several pieces that were painstakingly reconstructed by the excavators are characterized by both an elegance and a simplicity of design and proportion. Like the earlier furniture known from artifacts and depictions, these objects incorporate animal and floral elements that display a high degree of realism. Hetepheres I's gilded bed bears a striking similarity to the beds represented in the tomb of Hesi-Re but differs from them in its addition of a footboard and use of leonine rather than bovine legs. Her chairs are also fitted with leonine legs, which from the Fourth Dynasty forward became common. Of the 2 chairs found only one could be reconstructed completely, but both appear to have had similar solid cubic forms with low, deep seats and decorated side panels. Carved in an openwork pattern beneath the armrest of the reconstructed chair are 3 gilded papyrus heads and stalks tied together in a cluster. Motifs based on natural forms appear as well in the ornamentation of other pieces from the tomb. For example, the ends of the carrying poles of the sedan chair are finished with gold palmiform capitals. Cat. Number 33. A faïence feather pattern decorates the bed's footboard, while rosettes alternate with a feather motif on the back of the second armchair, each of whose side panels bears a falcon sitting upon a palm column. Basketry and mat patterns long in use are also seen in Hetepheres I's furniture, decorating uprights from her portable canopy in the reconstructed chair. Tools and methods of production. At the beginning of the Archaic period, copper implements became widespread, largely replacing the flint tools of earlier times and making finely detailed woodworking feasible. Walter Emery discovered a large cache of copper carpenter's tools in the First Dynasty mastaba tomb 3471 at Saqqara. 7, which provides evidence that the implements of the ancient carpenters are in many respects similar to those of today's artisans. Axes and saws were employed initially to split and shape green wood. Larger pieces of timber were tied to an upright post and cut from the top downward with a short saw. However, unlike many modern saws that cut when pushed or pulled, ancient saws cut only when the tool was pulled. Moreover, the teeth of the early saws face in the direction of the handle and do not necessarily extend over the entire length of the blade. The use of this type of saw combined with the poor quality of indigenous timbers often resulted in the production of short planks of wood. The freshly manufactured planks would have been left to dry before they were made into furniture in order to avoid problems created by the contraction of moist green wood. For curved elements, timbers were heated and then bent, or naturally curved pieces of wood were adapted and integrated. 8 Carpenters relied upon copper adze blades lashed to wood handles to plane and trim wood surfaces, while bow drills and awls bored holes that were required in joints for the insertion of lashing or in chair frames for attachments for woven seats, for example. Several types of copper chisels were used. Some were hit with heavy wood or stone mallets to cut joints, whereas others were employed for hand carving and detail work, with the required pressure being administered by hand. The final smoothing of the piece was accomplished with sandstone polishers. The sharpness of a tool edge was maintained by honing it on an oiled sharpening stone, usually a flat piece of slate. 9. Butt joints and simple miter joints were the most commonly used type of joint. However, mortise and tenon joints, half-lap joints, scarf joints with butterfly clamps, dovetail joints, and many more complex varieties of miter joints, including shoulder, double shoulder, dovetailed miter housing, and miter housing corner joints, were also employed. 10 Throughout much of the Old Kingdom, wet leather thongs drawn through holes were used to lash components together and to reinforce joints. As the leather dried, it contracted, thus securing the connection. Holes drilled in the top of a bed leg, for example, allowed it to be tied to the bed's wood frame with a thong. The addition of a tenon on the leg top, fitted into a mortise on the frame, often provided additional support. 11 However, wood dowels, animal glues, and cleats gradually supplanted much thong lashing. Dowels appeared as early as the 2nd dynasty, 12, and during the 5th dynasty the use of animal glues became widespread. These glues were manufactured from boiled animal hides and bone, much as they are today, and applied by brush. Gesso made from gypsum was also employed as an adhesive for inlays in gold leaf. Thicker gold sheeting was attached by small nails. 13 Occasionally the surface of poor caliber wood was covered with a thin sheet of finer wood, often ebony. This veneer was affixed with a resin early in the Old Kingdom and with a glue later in the period, while larger fragments were attached by small dowels or nails. The use of veneer as early as the 1st dynasty is documented by a box discovered by Emery in the tomb of Hamaka at Saqqara. A carpenter's workshop depicted in the 5th dynasty Mastaba at Saqqara. Figure 71:15 shows artisans engaged in the preparation of wood, which they are shaping, sawing, smoothing, bending, drilling, and polishing, and in furniture construction. A headrest sits on the floor, while craftsmen polish a chest, drill a hole in a box lid, and fashion boxes in a bed. In a similar scene from the 5th dynasty tomb of Meruka at Saqqara, carpenters are making a bed, a door, and several other objects, notably chests and tables, many of which incorporate architectural elements. There are, for example, chests with gable lids. Moreover, chests with cavito cornices are depicted in the early 5th dynasty pyramid temple of Sur at Abu Sir. 17 Such representations of furniture and everyday scenes of carpenters at work, as well as the frequent inclusion of furniture and models within tombs, underscore the importance of the role furniture played in the lives of the ancient Egyptians. Stone vessels. Luxury items with manifold implications. Stone vessels of the Old Kingdom are luxury items that owe their beauty to skilled craftsmanship and an exquisite sense of refinement in design and decoration. The art of stone vessel making goes back almost to the beginning of Egyptian history, and consequently, in the 3rd dynasty, when King Djoser's artisans were given the task of producing tens of thousands of stone vases for the subterranean storerooms of the step pyramid at Saqqara, Cat. Number 5. 1. They were fully equipped to meet the demand. Since the 5th millennium B.C.E., long before stone was used for building and statuary, vessels had been fashioned from hard stones. Indeed, the art had reached its peak just before the reign of Djoser, during the first 2 dynasties, with the production of vessels that imitated an extremely hard and brittle stone, and with astonishing accuracy, such flimsy items as a basket made of reeds and the leaf of a lotus plant. Stone materials. By the 3rd dynasty, Stone vessel making had become a somewhat more conventional craft than it had been during archaic times. The materials used were less far-eyed than in the earlier period, when they had encompassed practically every type of hard stone available in stone-rich Egypt. For throughout the Old Kingdom most stone vessels were made of the white or yellowish white, sometimes even brownish, so-called Egyptian alabaster. 5. The semi-translucent, beautifully veined material is actually calcite, not a true alabaster. 6. Some scholars prefer to call it travertine. 7. Although the typical travertine does not share the distinctive translucency of Egyptian alabaster. 8. True alabaster, a fine-grained granular aggregate of gypsum, was occasionally used for stone vessels in the Archaic period but not as far as is known during the Old Kingdom. 9. The ancient Egyptian word for Egyptian alabaster is ssd, pronounced set by Egyptologists. 10. The material occurs at many places in the limestone region of the Egyptian deserts. Quarries known to have been exploited for by the ancient Egyptians are predominantly located in the eastern desert, from south of Cairo, Wadi el Garawi, to Asyut. Best known among them is the quarry of Hatnub, near Amarna. 2. Although through trace element analysis it is possible to determine from which location the material of specific stone vessels derived, such investigations have so far been undertaken on only a small number of objects. 12. In addition to Egyptian alabaster, stone vessel makers of the Old Kingdom relied on diorite, gneiss, cat. Number 99, and, above all, limestone 1-3 with some frequency, but they rarely employed porphyry, granite, breccia, basalt, quartz crystal, and obsidian. 14. Some of these materials were available to the craftsmen as refuse from sculptors' workshops. The shapes and decoration of stone vessels. The stone vessel makers of the Old Kingdom worked too much under the influence of their forebears to create a totally new set of shapes. Their contributions to the formal repertoire of Egyptian stone vessel art were the refinement of pre-existing shapes and the introduction of shapes imitating terracotta and metal prototypes. Figure 72. Since the beginning of the art form in pre-dynastic times, Egyptian stone vessel shapes typically had been close to basic geometric solids. 16. In the Archaic period and the Old Kingdom, however, subtle deviations from pure geometric form became characteristic. The traditional ointment jars, for instance, had been cylindrical with straight or slightly bulging sides from the pre-dynastic Naqada I period, about 3850 to 3650 BC. During the Archaic period these vases started to become conical, a tendency that continued during the Old Kingdom. 17. When, moreover, most of their walls were concave, and they showed ever wider bases. In vessels of the 5th and 6th dynasties, Cat. Numbers 179,180, the splayed foot was beautifully counterpoised by a broad rim. During the 6th dynasty stone vessel making entered a new phase of creativity. Vessel shapes of that period, Cat. Numbers 178 to 180, 184, are of a variety unparalleled since the end of the Archaic period. 19. They also reveal traits that can only be called manners. For instance, the widely splayed bases of some cylindrical vessels, Cat. Numbers 179, 180, 20 and the exaggeratedly lengthened proportions of jars, among which an intricately shaped col lore type is especially common. Figure 72, bottom right. Decoration on stone vessels of the Old Kingdom is mainly confined to rope patterns and designs that imitate the nets in which Egyptians daily carried large and small containers. Cat. Number 5. Other decorative elements are incised hieroglyphic inscriptions and symbolic motifs. Cat. Numbers 179,180, 184, which are discussed below. Some delightful examples are sculpted. Cat. Number 178. 22. Like most high-quality stone vessels, these intriguing vases were doubtless the work of court artisans. The techniques of stone vessel making. The production of stone vessels is frequently depicted in Old Kingdom wall reliefs and paintings. 24. Because few workshops have been found. 25. Much of what is said about methods of manufacture must rely on inference from these representations and other evidence. 26. The craftsman appears to have started by cutting a stone roughly into the desired shape of the vessel. This must have been done with the help of dolerite pounders. Cat. Number 36, and copper chisels. Pieces discarded in an unfinished state show that the outside of the container was then fully finished and smoothed by rubbing with a hard stone. Only after the exterior shape was achieved did the craftsman start to hollow out the interior, a task accomplished, at least from the Archaic period, with the so-called crank drill. Figure 73. 27. This instrument consisted basically of a long piece of wood with a handle on top. Below the handle, 2 heavy stones were fastened with ropes. Recent investigations by the experimental archaeologist Stocks have revealed that these stones did not provide momentum during the work process but served solely to weigh down the drill. 28 The instrument often had a forked bottom that helped to fasten the drill bit. Both this fork and the handle on top of the drill were made of single naturally shaped tree branches. Some representations of the crank drill show a shaft composed of 2 parts that are lashed together. Figure 73. Stocks has convincingly explained that shafts of this kind must have been fashioned to facilitate replacement of the lower end of the drill when it wore down from use. Drill bits were made in various shapes and of many materials. There were triangular bits of flint whose points wore off through use, which accounts for the fact that discarded bits of flint found in excavations are usually crescent-shaped. There were also drill bits of diorite, quartzite, and limestone. Shapes included figure 8 forms and roughly rectangular cones with indentations in the center of both long sides into which the forked ends of the drill could be fitted. 30 Tubular bits of copper may sometimes have been employed as well, especially for the initial drilling of the cavity. Indeed, a small groove around the bottom of the interior of a number of conical ointment vessels perhaps indicates their use. The drill shaft to which such copper tubes might have been fitted would, of course, have had no fork at its lower end. Stocks has demonstrated that the crank drill was probably not turned continuously in one direction but rather was twisted forward and backward, clockwise and counterclockwise, either between the 2 hands that held the shaft and handle of the instrument or by one hand while the other steadied the instrument or the vessel. 32 This procedure appears to assure a high degree of stability and a well-centered drilling process. Archaeological evidence reveals that the ancient Egyptian drilling technique also involved placing the vessel in a hole in the ground or other work area. Thus, in the Old Kingdom stone vessel workshop excavated at Hierakonpolis, sockets suitable for holding vessels were found in a workbench of beaten earth. 33 In a wood model of early Middle Kingdom date represents in miniature a carpenter's workshop in which a stone vessel maker is also found at home. This artisan uses a large round white object, probably a stone with a hole in its top, as a support for the vase he is drilling. 34 A difficult stage in the hollowing process must have been reached when the center cavity of a jar of broad shape was bored and the craftsman had to enlarge the interior space on all sides. Some archaeologists believe that the drill was held obliquely to widen the cavity, while others have followed Reisner, who maintained that a succession of ever larger drill bits was used. 35 Certainly a number of bits of different shapes were employed to obtain the desired volume and shape of the interior. Whenever possible, the artisan probably effected the final thinning of the walls by inserting his hand into the vase cell and smoothing down the interior by rubbing with a hard stone. Figure 73. Sand and other suitable powdery substances were used as abrasives during all stages of the work, including the final polishing of the outer surface. The function and distribution of stone vessels. Stone vessels served various purposes in the life and afterlife of the ancient Egyptians. 3 groups can be distinguished among the Old Kingdom vessels: cosmetic, oil and ointment vases, many inscribed with the names and titles of kings, cat. Numbers 178 to 180, imitations in stone of terracotta utilitarian vessels, cat. Numbers 160, 161, and miniature vases, cat. Number 214. Imitation vases and miniature vessels will be dealt with exclusively in the relevant entries, but some general remarks about the cosmetic, oil and ointment vases are called for here. The storage of cosmetic oils and ointments was by far the most important function of stone vessels in ancient Egypt. 37 Their thick stone walls helped to keep the fatty substances they held cool, and their exquisite workmanship and high quality underlined the precious nature of the contents. Cosmetic ointments were used in everyday life and also in important rituals in temples and tombs. Cult statues and cult objects, figure 74, in temples of gods and in pyramid temples, for instance, were treated daily with cosmetic materials and reviving ointments. 38 No wonder temple storerooms were filled with precious vase cells containing these ingredients. 39 And the stone vases were left as votives in sanctuaries. 40 And were standard items in foundation deposits. 4 Anointing and cosmetic treatment also played a role in the preparation of mummies. 42 Which were treated with oils and in the funerary cult based on the belief in the reviving effect of the oils and ointments. Thus there was a double reason for these stone receptacles to accompany the deceased into the grave. Accordingly, they appear frequently in burial sites, 44 including royal ones, as evidenced by the numerous stone cosmetic vases discovered in the 18th dynasty tomb of Tutankhamun. 45. Stone vessels were deposited not only in the tombs of later pharaohs but also in the pyramids and pyramid precincts of Old Kingdom rulers. Today, having escaped centuries of plunder by virtue of their durability, these receptacles are often the only surviving remains from the once rich assortment of goods that accompanied a Pyramid-Age king into his afterlife and served the cult of his statues in the Pyramid Temple. Their numbers are considerable, as demonstrated by the tens of thousands of Djoser's stone vessels mentioned above, which still rest in the underground chambers of the ruler's step pyramid at Saqqara, too numerous to ever be fully extracted. 46. The custom of burying vast quantities of vessels inside the tombs of kings and other individuals of high status goes back to late pre-dynastic times in the Archaic period. 47 However, after the Third Dynasty, as subterranean space in royal tombs diminished and the size of the pyramid temples increased, vessels were deposited in greater numbers in the storerooms of the above-ground temples. Testifying to this development, hundreds of stone vessels were found in the storerooms of the Valley Temple of Menkaure. 48 and considerable remains of vase cells mostly broken and incomplete were excavated from the pyramid temples of Sur, Neferkar, and Usur. 49 stone vessels were, nevertheless, also deposited in the interiors of pyramids. In the Pyramid of King Pepi II, for instance, precious remains of inscribed stone jars were discovered inside the passage leading to the ruler's burial chamber. Figure 7.5. 50. Many stone vessels found inside pyramid precincts were inscribed with the names of predecessors of the owner of the pyramid, while others can be dated on stylistic grounds to periods earlier than his own. 51. Evidently, then, such stone vessels were deposited in royal pyramid complexes to make use of items left over from previous royal burials or bygone festivities. 52. It is also possible that very old vase cells were left in the pyramid precincts in the belief that their proven longevity ensured an eternal flow of provisions even more effectively than did contemporary objects. Not all stone vessels of the Old Kingdom inscribed with royal names. Cat. Numbers 178 to 180. 184-53 were part of the burial equipment of kings, for there have been finds of such faces in the pyramids of queens, in the tombs of high officials, and even in the burial sites of members of the middle class, especially in the provinces. 54. These finds indicate that stone vases were customary gifts from the pharaoh to members of his family, worthy officials, and other favored individuals, a good number of whom were women. 55. Such gifts may have been intended to serve as grave goods from the outset, as favored individuals were commonly recompensed with items for the tomb in the Old Kingdom. 56. Or they may have been granted during the recipient's lifetime, to find their way into the tomb later, when the proud owner died. Stone vases were not only bestowed upon those favored by the king but also were given to him by appropriate persons. The latter especially seems to have been the custom during the Third Dynasty. 57. As is suggested by several vases found in the underground galleries of the Djoser Pyramid. These vessels are inscribed with the names of contemporaries of Djoser, who Hike believed had been employed in preparing the king's funeral, an office that perhaps entitled them to make contributions to the royal burial equipment. 58. Inscriptions on a number of stone vases testify to one important event during which a pharaoh might have given or received stone vessels, the Heb said or first Heb said, that is, the 30-year jubilee of a king, figure 51, cat. Numbers 178 to 180. 59. As various authors indicate in this catalogue, this jubilee and successive ones marked at varying intervals thereafter were more than commemorations of a prosperous and happy rule over the course of many years. They were occasions for the performance of age-old rituals believed to grant the king physical, and probably also mental, rejuvenation. Anointing and cosmetic pigment application were included in several of these rituals, as Vari.os representations revealed. 61 Image, figure 74, for instance, shows the king in the traditional Heb said garment applying ointment to the sacred standard of the god Wepwy in his chapel. Does it go too far to suggest that the leftovers of the oils and cosmetics used at the Heb said were distributed in stone vase cells to meritorious individuals and members of the royal family in order to let them partake of the beneficial effects of the rituals? And can it also be surmised that officials bestowed their gifts upon the pharaoh at the festival itself, just as a courtier of high status is shown in one tomb giving pectorals to Amenhotep III of the New Kingdom on the occasion of his third Heb said 61 in the hope of benefiting from the magic power of the rituals enacted there? The designs of the inscriptions incised on the stone vessels underline the significance of the gifts. The writing is invariably arranged inside a rectangular panel, the top of which is formed by the hieroglyph for sky and whose sides are two words. Dominion, scepters, 62 A well-known device depicting the world. 63 Royal names are inscribed within this kind of emblematic framework, albeit mostly without reference to a HEB said, on luxury objects, such as a box and an ivory headdress in the exhibition, cat. Numbers 181,183, on the sides of the thrones of royal statues beginning in the 4th dynasty, 64 and on architectural elements. In the Pyramid Temple of Sur, for instance, the columns surrounding the central courtyard carry the image, figure 76, 65 here one of the two heads of the earth god Aker flanks either end of the baseline of the rectangle, identifying it unmistakably as a representation of the earth. 66. And the rectangles on all these objects, statues, and architectural elements, the names and titles of the king are usually arranged vertically so that the hieroglyphic signs for King of Upper and Lower Egypt and Horus are located directly below the sky emblem. Parts of the inscription, moreover, often face each other, cat. Number 180, an arrangement made possible by the nature of hieroglyphic script, which can be written, and read, both right to left and left to right. As a result of this confrontation, the main images and signs tend to face toward the interior of the panel, thus transforming the inscription into a heraldic motto that proclaims the idea of kingship. 67 Good wishes for eternal life, stability, and health are incorporated at the bottom of the panels, and on many stone vessels a reference to the HEB set or first HEB set appears within, under, or to the side of them, cat. Number 179. The carefully structured royal name panels serve to propagate the idea of the central position of kingship in a stable universe that is upheld by divine powers and protection. Even more explicit in terms of this function are the designs on a number of globular jars. On one inscribed for King Unis, for instance, a Horus falcon stretches its wings, while its claws clutch Shen signs of universality. From each Shen sign a royal cobra extends beneath each wing, and in front of each cobra's hood a symbol for life points sword or cartouche bearing the ruler's name, cat. Number 123. 68 As Ziegler has noted, this configuration is remarkably similar to Middle Kingdom royal jewelry designs. 69 Yet there are also obvious parallels between the rectangular name panels and royal jewelry motifs, especially the beautiful pectorals of the Middle Kingdom, figure 77, New Kingdom, and Third Intermediate Period. True, most of these pectorals are framed not by the sky hieroglyph, earth emblem, and with scepters but by the cornice roof of a shrine or temple supported either by simple borders of various colors or by plants, and in one case even by columns. 70 Nevertheless, the link exists, for the temples of ancient Egypt were generally considered to symbolize the world, with the roof representing the sky, with stars, the columns the plants, and the floor the earth. Also clearly underscoring the connection between the shrine-enclosed pectoral designs and the sky plus with scepter image are a mid-12th dynasty pectoral in the Metropolitan Museum without sides or top frame but showing a baseline identified as the primeval water 71, one of the earliest known of its type, and one of Tutankhamun's many pectorals that use the device of the sky with the scepter supports. 72. It is well known that pectorals played an important role in the rituals of the HEB said. 73 Indeed, in the tomb of Khufu, a high official of the 18th dynasty King Amenhotep III and the steward of Amenhotep's queen, Khufu is depicted offering elaborate pectorals to the pharaoh on the occasion of his third HEB said. 74 That pectorals and other jewelry of the Middle Kingdom also figured in the HEB set has been shown as well. 75 And during the Middle Kingdom female members of the royal family wore pectorals inscribed with the king's name and titles, which were buried with them when they died. In all these contexts strikingly close analogies can be drawn between the post-Zoroid Kingdom pectorals and Pyramid-Age stone vessels. Both groups of objects serve to propagate basic ideas about kingship, played parts in the HEB said, and involved not only male officials but also female members of the royal family, court ladies, and even women of not much more than middle-class station. 76. We must assume that a king's gifts of pectorals in the Middle and New Kingdoms and of stone vessels in the Old Kingdom made during the recipient's lifetime were intended to strengthen the awareness of the royal ideology among the pharaoh's associates, and it should be assumed as well that the eventual burial of these objects secured benefits not only for the recipient of the gift but also for the king himself. The presence of hundreds of stone vessels carrying the royal motto in tombs in all areas of the country, including the outlying oases in the desert, certainly broadened the magical basis that ensured the king's eternal life and everlasting power and might even have served to procure a HEB said for him in the afterlife. 77 This kind of magical proliferation, it appears, was thought to have worked especially well when a female burial contained the object decorated with the royal name, since the king's rebirth was believed to be guaranteed in a particularly potent way through females, wife, mother, court lady, indeed any woman. 78. The association of stone cosmetic vases with revivifying female forces is also apparent in the delightful group of stone vessels sculpted in the shape of mother monkeys with their young cat. Number 178. Through the monkey forms, these flasks evoke aspects of fertility and motherhood linked with the rejuvenating powers of the cosmetic oils they held, the exotic provenances of some of their ingredients, and associations with certain gods. Thus myrrh, a frequently used substance, was imported from Punt, an East African country bordering the Red Sea that according to the mythology of ancient Egypt was the country of the gods 79 and, in a more mundane sense, the home of monkeys. 80 And in an important ancient Egyptian myth is the god Thoth in the shape of a monkey who cajoles the goddess Hathor to come back to Egypt after her flight to the faraway south. 81 Significantly, the monkey flasks also refer to kingship because the arms and bodies of most of the animals bear the names of 6th dynasty rulers, often accompanied by mentions of the Heb said cat. Number 178a. Archaeological excavations have revealed additional important information about the uses of monkey vessels. Like other stone cosmetic vessels, vases in the shape of mother monkeys were found in the tombs of high officials, such as the governor of the Dakhla Oasis, 83, and were buried in graves of women. 84 But monkey flasks were also dedicated as votives in the sanctuaries of female deities, for instance, the sanctuary of the goddess Satata Elephantine, 85, and the temple of Hathor Balak Gabal at Byblos, near present-day Beirut in Lebanon, 86, once again underlining the strong association of the ointment vessels, kingship, and female forces. The locations of the finds at the oasis in Dakhla, and the sanctuaries at the southern border of Egypt and Elephantine, and in the Pharaoh port of Byblos add another dimension to the picture, for the desert and foreign lands were traditionally the realm of female deities, in particular Hathor. If the king saw to it that vessels with his name were distributed to these far-flung areas, he must have done so to procure for that name and his might the greatest possible range of magical proliferation and at the same time to enlist the support of the divine mistress of all outlying regions. 87. The finds of monkey vases and other Egyptian stone vessels at Byblos, moreover, offer significant evidence that religion, mythology, and magic were intricately linked with politics and the economy in Old Kingdom Egypt. Byblos was a main trading partner of Egypt during the period and as such the most important port through which valuable cedarwood was supplied for the pharaoh's buildings and for fine carpentry work in the royal workshops, and thus a place to which Egyptians would have sent goods such as stone vessels. 88 In the Pyramid Temple of Sihar, the departure and return of an entire fleet of seagoing ships is depicted in relief. 89 Although their destination is not named among the preserved fragments of the scene, that it was in Asia can be deduced from the fact that the returning ships bear sea attics. Just such ships may well have transported stone vessels, presumably filled with precious oils and ointments, to Byblos. 90 We can perhaps assume that at least some of these vases were originally gifts from the pharaohs to dignitaries of the city with whom they wished to strengthen ties. Because a number of vessels appear to be inscribed with the names of non-royal Egyptians, it is also possible that Egyptian officials brought the vessels with them on trading missions to Byblos. These officials may have presented the vases directly to the local goddess, 91, or they may have given them to their trading partners, who subsequently dedicated them to the deity. 92. However the vases reached this foreign city, they were obviously cherished by the inhabitants in a special way and for considerable time. Archaeological evaluation has demonstrated that the stratum and the temple area in which the vessels were found was laid down well after the period of the Old Kingdom, during the 12th dynasty, about 1991 to 1878 BCE. 93 Several possible scenarios can be deduced from this fact. If the vessels were originally dedicated to the sanctuary at the time of the Old Kingdom, they may have been kept in the temple storerooms for hundreds of years and deposited in the ground during the 12th dynasty, presumably when an old temple building was demolished to make way for a new one. 94 It is also possible that the vases were buried in the era of the Old Kingdom and that the debris in which they were deposited was relocated during the 12th dynasty. However, if the monkey vases were initially gifts to inhabitants of Byblos, they may have remained in the families of the recipients as heirlooms until the 12th dynasty, when they found their way into the temple. If that was the case, it is noteworthy that even the remote descendants of the first owners of the monkey vases were aware of a meaningful connection between the vessels and the female deity who was the temple's mistress. This reminds us that Old Kingdom stone vessels not only are objects of impeccable design and refined craftsmanship but also had deep significance in the culture. While we enjoy their beauty, then, it is also well worth reflecting on their close relationship to two of the most important concepts held by the ancient Egyptians, the cosmic nature of kingship and belief in the God-given powers of rejuvenation and rebirth.